She had everything: a billion-dollar empire, a name that made Wall Street flinch, and enough power to bury competitors before they finished their morning coffee. But on that rain-soaked night in Savannah, Isabella Sterling, the most powerful woman in American business, stood dripping wet on the side of a back road, staring at the dim light of a stranger's woodworking shop, about to say the four most humiliating words of her life. "I need a husband." And the worst part? She meant every single word. If this story already has you hooked, you're not alone. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain came without warning. One moment, the Georgia sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the city of Savannah like a fist. The next, it opened up completely. A wall of water that turned the evening into something close to night, hammering the asphalt, flooding the gutters, turning the Spanish moss on the oak trees into dark, dripping curtains. Isabella Sterling didn't notice until her windshield went completely white. She hit the wipers. They smeared more than they cleared. She leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the glass at a road she barely recognized, because this wasn't a road she was supposed to be on. Her driver, Marcus, had called in sick that afternoon. Her assistant, Priya, had offered to arrange a car service. Isabella had waved her off. "I can drive myself," she'd said, in that tone she used when she considered a conversation finished. She was regretting that now. The Macon Highway exit had looked familiar on the GPS, but somewhere between the third missed turn and the moment the rain became a genuine disaster, she'd ended up on a two-lane road with no streetlights and trees so thick on either side they formed a tunnel of darkness. The GPS was recalculating. It had been recalculating for 4 minutes. Isabella was beginning to suspect it had given up on her entirely, which would make it the third thing that day to do so. The car shuddered. Not a gentle shudder, a violent mechanical convulsion that ran through the chassis like a death rattle. The steering wheel yanked hard to the right. Isabella gripped it with both hands and pulled back, jaw clenched, heart slamming against her ribs. She managed to guide the car off the road and onto a gravel shoulder before it died completely. Engine just stopping the way a conversation stops when someone says something unforgivable. Silence. Rain on the roof. The tick of the cooling engine. Isabella sat perfectly still for a moment, both hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. Then she reached for her phone. No signal. She stared at the single bar that flickered in and out of existence like it was mocking her. She held the phone up toward the roof of the car. She angled it toward the window. She did the thing everyone does in moments of cellular desperation. She moved it in slow, deliberate circles, as if the signal were a shy animal she could coax out of hiding. Nothing. She set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked out the rain-blurred window. Through the downpour, maybe 200 yards ahead, she could see a light. Not the kind of light that meant a gas station or a diner. It was dimmer than that, warmer, the yellow-orange glow of something happening inside a building rather than a sign meant to attract attention. A workshop, maybe. A garage. She looked down at her shoes. They were Manolo Blahnik pumps, cream-colored, $300. She'd worn them to the board meeting that morning because she'd learned a long time ago that the right shoes in a room full of powerful men communicated something that no amount of data or quarterly projections could. They communicated permanence. I belong here. I am not going anywhere. She was about to ruin them in a Georgia rainstorm. Isabella Sterling pushed open the car door and stepped out into the rain. She was soaked through before she'd taken 20 steps. The gravel shoulder gave way to wet grass and then to a narrow dirt path that ran alongside the road. Her heels sank with every step. She pulled one foot free with a sound that was deeply undignified, kept walking, and made a decision somewhere around step 40 that she was never going to mention this to anyone. Not Priya, not her PR team, not the journalist from Forbes who had described her last year as a woman seemingly immune to the chaos she creates in markets around the world. The building was a workshop. That much was clear as she got closer. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Brooks Custom Woodworking," the letters slightly uneven, the paint a dark green that had started to peel at the corners. Through the single window, she could see the orange glow of a work lamp and the silhouette of someone moving inside. She knocked. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the movement inside stopped. She knocked again, harder. The door opened. The man who answered it was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd been expecting. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than a gym membership. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, sawdust on his forearms, and an expression that moved through surprise, confusion, and what might have been alarm in the space of about 2 seconds. He looked at her, standing in the rain in a ruined cream blazer and designer heels that had clearly lost their battle with the Georgia mud, and said nothing. "My car broke down," Isabella said. The rain was hitting her in the face. She refused to look anything other than composed. "About 200 yards back on the road. I don't have cell service. I need to call for help." The man blinked. He had dark eyes, brown maybe, hard to tell in this light. And there was sawdust in his hair as well as on his arms. He looked like he'd been in the middle of something, interrupted mid-thought. "You don't have cell service?" he said. "That's what I said." He glanced past her toward the road, as if confirming that she had, in fact, arrived from the direction of nowhere in particular. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said, "before you drown." The workshop smelled like pine and linseed oil and something else underneath. Wood shavings, maybe, or sawdust that had been there so long it had become part of the walls. It was a single large room with a concrete floor, a workbench that ran the entire length of one wall, and tools hung with careful precision on pegboards above it. Half-finished pieces of furniture occupied various corners: a rocking chair with no seat, a cabinet with its doors not yet attached, something that was either a bookcase or a very ambitious chicken coop. In the far corner, sitting on a 3-legged stool with a picture book open on her lap, was a small girl. She looked up when Isabella came through the door. She was maybe 7 or 8, with her father's dark eyes and a gap where one of her front teeth had recently been. She was wearing pajama pants with cartoon foxes on them and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too large. She looked at Isabella with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only children and very old people are capable of. "You're all wet," the girl said. "I'm aware," Isabella said. "Daddy, she's all wet." "I see that, Bug." The man, her father, moved to the workbench and picked up a phone that was plugged into the wall. A landline, an actual landline with a cord, which Isabella hadn't seen outside of a hotel room in probably 15 years. He held it out to her. "It works. Not fancy, but it works." Isabella took it. "Thank you." She called Marcus first. He didn't answer. It was almost 9 at night, and he was presumably sick in bed, which she couldn't hold against him, even if the timing was catastrophically inconvenient. She called the car service company and was told their next available driver was 90 minutes out. She called roadside assistance and was told the same. She hung up and stood holding the receiver for a moment. The little girl had gotten off her stool and was standing 3 feet away, looking up at Isabella with great interest. "Are you a princess?" she asked. "No," Isabella said. "You look like a princess, but your shoes are dirty." "Sophie." The man's voice had a gentle warning in it. "It's all right," Isabella said, and surprised herself slightly by meaning it. She looked at the girl. "What's your name?" "Sophie Brooks. I'm 7 3/4. "What's your name?" "Isabella." "That is a princess name," Sophie said with great satisfaction, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Isabella almost smiled. Almost. She looked at the man who had gone back to his workbench and was doing something with a piece of sandpaper that suggested he was trying to look occupied while also monitoring the situation in his peripheral vision. He had the manner of someone accustomed to handling unexpected things calmly, which she noted without quite knowing what to do with it. "The driver is 90 minutes out," she said. I apologize for the intrusion. I'll wait outside." "You'll wait outside," he repeated, turning to look at her. "In the car." "In the car," he said. "In the rain." "The rain will stop eventually." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he pulled a folding chair from somewhere near the workbench, set it open in the center of the room, and said, "Sit down. I'll make coffee." It wasn't an offer exactly. It was more like a decision he'd made on her behalf. Isabella sat down. His name was Ethan Brooks. He volunteered this while handing her a mug of coffee that was black and slightly too hot, and the best thing she'd tasted in recent memory, possibly because she'd skipped lunch. He didn't offer cream or sugar, just set the mug in her hands and returned to his workbench, which she took as either pragmatism or a refusal to fuss. "How long have you had the shop?" she asked, because the silence felt like something that needed filling, and she was better at questions than she was at small talk. 6 years. He ran the sandpaper along the edge of a piece of oak. Started in the garage. Outgrew it. "It's a good location," she said, which was not entirely true. It was in the middle of nowhere, but she said it the way she might say it in a meeting when she needed to find something genuine to offer. He glanced at her sideways. "Not really, but the rent is low and I like the quiet." Sophie had climbed back onto her stool and resumed her picture book. She turned pages with the concentration of someone reading a legal brief. "Does she always stay here with you this late?" Isabella asked. "Babysitter canceled." He said it without explanation or apology, the way people state facts when they've made peace with the complications of their own life. "She's fine. She's reading." "I'm reading about a fox," Sophie confirmed without looking up. Isabella wrapped both hands around the mug and looked around the workshop. There were framed photos on one shelf between two coffee tins. A small collection, not a display, just things that had accumulated there. One was a photo of Sophie as a toddler, laughing at something off camera. One was of Ethan and a woman, younger, standing in front of what looked like the ocean. The woman had red hair and Sophie's exact smile. Isabella looked away. She'd done enough research on people in her life to recognize grief when it was arranged quietly on a shelf, between coffee tins, in a way that said, "This is still here, but I've learned to work around it." She said nothing. Ethan kept sanding. Outside, the rain continued. She had been in the workshop for 40 minutes when her second phone, the encrypted one that only 7 people in the world had the number for, started ringing. She'd forgotten she had it in her inside jacket pocket. She pulled it out. The screen said David Cole, her head of legal, which meant something had happened. David Cole did not call after 8 o'clock for anything short of a fire. "Excuse me," she said, and stepped toward the door, which still admitted a draft of rain-wet air when she cracked it. "David." "Isabella." His voice was careful in the way that voices get when the news is bad enough that the speaker is choosing each word like a step across ice. "I'm sorry to call this late. We have a situation." "Tell me." She listened. She stood in the draft from the cracked door with her coffee going cold in her other hand, and she listened to David Cole explain in his careful, measured way that Gerald Whitmore, a board member she had never fully trusted, had apparently spent the last 3 weeks quietly pulling together a coalition, that he had found, or claimed to have found, a clause in her grandfather's will. That this clause, which none of her legal team had flagged in the 18 months since Harrison Sterling's death, specified that control of Sterling Global passed to the board of directors in the event that the primary heir remained unmarried at the time of her 30th birthday. Isabella's 30th birthday was tomorrow. How did we miss this? Her voice was very quiet. It was buried, deliberately, we think. The language was obscured in a rider attached to the estate documentation from... How did Whitmore find it? A pause. We don't know yet. How many board members does he have? Enough to call a vote, possibly enough to win it. David paused again. Isabella, if they vote tomorrow morning... I know what happens if they vote tomorrow morning. She stood there for a moment after he'd finished. The rain came in against her face through the crack in the door. Cold, real, 30 years old tomorrow. The company she'd spent her entire adult life building, protecting, fighting for. The company her grandfather had built before her and her father had nearly destroyed and she had rebuilt from a smoking ruin of debt and bad deals, could be taken from her by morning. By a clause in a dead man's will and a board member who'd been waiting years for exactly this kind of leverage, unless she was married, by tomorrow. She stared out into the rain for a very long time. Then she turned around and walked back into the workshop. Ethan looked up when she came back in. Something in her face made him set the sandpaper down. Sophie had fallen asleep on her stool somehow, listing to one side with her picture book sliding off her lap. Ethan reached over and caught the book without looking at it, set it on the workbench, and turned to face Isabella. "Everything okay?" he asked. No, she said. It's not. She'd had about 45 seconds to decide how to handle this, which was more time than she'd had in some of the highest stakes negotiations of her career. She was not a person who operated on impulse. Every move she made was calculated, weighed, considered from 4 directions before execution. What she was about to do was none of those things. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to understand that I'm completely serious before you react. He was watching her with that careful, level expression again. Okay. She met his eyes. I need a husband before tomorrow morning. The workshop was very quiet. Rain on the roof, Sophie breathing softly in the corner. Ethan didn't laugh. She was grateful for that. He didn't look at her like she'd lost her mind either, or if he did, he kept it off his face. He just looked at her steadily, the way he'd looked at everything since she'd walked in his door, with the unhurried attention of someone who wasn't going anywhere and wasn't easily rattled. You're serious, he said finally. I told you I was. You don't know me. I know your name is Ethan Brooks. I know you run a woodworking shop and you have a 7-year-old daughter who thinks I look like a princess. I know you make decent coffee and you caught a book without looking at it, which tells me you pay attention to things without making a production of it. She paused. I know you haven't tried to take a photo of me, which means you either don't know who I am or you're not the kind of person who does that. Something moved across his face. I know who you are. Then you understand what I'm asking and why. I understand what you're asking. He leaned back against the workbench and crossed his arms. I don't understand the why exactly. Walk me through it. So she did. She stood in the middle of his sawdust-smelling workshop in her ruined shoes with her soaked blazer starting to dry stiff and wrong. And she told Ethan Brooks the truth, all of it, in the flat, precise way she presented facts in boardrooms because she had no energy left for anything softer. The clause, the vote, the timeline, the 14 hours between now and the moment she lost everything her family had built. She told him the terms she was prepared to offer, a legal contract, full financial compensation, more than he'd likely see in 5 years of woodworking, a clean legal separation the moment the crisis passed. No entanglements, no complications. They'd live separately. The arrangement would be temporary and entirely on paper. When she was done, she stood there and waited. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Sophie, who was still asleep on her stool, one hand tucked under her chin. No, he said. Isabella had expected this. The financial offer isn't the point. He looked back at her, and his expression wasn't unkind, but it was very firm. I've been married. I know what it means. I'm not going to sign my name to something that turns it into a transaction. It would be a legal agreement, not a... Marriage is a legal agreement, he said. That's sort of the problem with your plan, if you think about it. She stared at him. He stared back. Outside, the rain began, finally, very slowly, to ease. I'm not asking you to feel anything, Isabella said. I'm asking you to sign a document. People who sign those documents tend to get tangled up in them anyway. His voice was quiet. I have a daughter. I'm not bringing chaos into her life, even temporary chaos, even for... He named a number she hadn't told him, a number that made her pause. However much money, it's not worth it. Isabella looked at Sophie. The little girl's picture book had foxes on the cover. There was a gap in her front teeth. She'd called Isabella a princess name and fallen asleep mid-story, like someone who trusted the world enough to let her guard down in the middle of it. I understand, Isabella said, and she did, genuinely. She'd expected this. She'd had a backup plan. She needed to find a phone signal and call David back and begin executing it, and she needed to do it in the next 20 minutes. She picked up her jacket. The road outside had turned into a shallow river. The headlights of the rescue vehicle were visible in the distance, coming early, apparently, or she'd been inside longer than she'd thought. She was standing in the doorway, watching the lights approach, when Ethan spoke from behind her. What happens to the people who work for you? She turned. He was still leaning against the workbench. He hadn't moved. What? If they vote you out tomorrow, the people who work for you, what happens to them? She hadn't expected that question. Not that one, not in those words. She turned it over for a moment before answering. Sterling Global employs about 14,000 people directly, more through contractors and suppliers. She paused. Whitmore's group wants to restructure. That's their word for it. The last company Whitmore restructured went from 2,200 employees to 800 in 18 months. Ethan was quiet. I'm not telling you that to manipulate you, she said. I'm telling you because you asked. I know. He was looking at the floor. He had a hand flat on the workbench, fingers spread, the way you brace yourself when you're thinking hard about something that costs something to think about. I know you are. He looked up. What are the actual terms? He asked. All of them, in plain language. She told him. All of it, again, more slowly this time, because something in his posture had shifted, and she recognized when a negotiation had moved into a different phase. He asked questions, specific, practical questions about what would be required of him publicly, how it would affect Sophie, what legal protections would be in place, what the exit looked like. The questions were good. They were the questions of someone who thought carefully about consequences. She answered everyone. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. Sophie stirred in the corner, resettled herself on the stool without waking, one hand reaching out automatically as if searching for something to hold. She found the edge of her picture book and held on to it. Ethan watched his daughter. 6 months, he said finally. That's my limit. 6 months and then it ends, cleanly, no complications. Sophie and I go back to our life. 6 months, Isabella agreed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. And she doesn't find out the truth. She's 7. She doesn't need to understand the mechanics. He paused, working through it. We're 2 people who met and decided to try. That's what she knows. Agreed. And I need it in writing, everything, before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'll have my legal team send documents within the hour. He nodded slowly. He picked up the sandpaper again, but didn't use it. Just held it, like something to do with his hands while his head settled around what he'd just agreed to. I don't know your last name, he said. Sterling. Isabella Sterling. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. You were on the cover of Fortune magazine last year? 3 times, actually. I only saw the one. He set the sandpaper down again. Sophie had cut out pictures for a school project and she found one of the magazines in the recycling. She asked me if the lady on the cover was a real person or one of those made-up people. Isabella stared at him. What did you say? I told her she was a real person. He looked up and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. I said you were someone who worked very hard and made a lot of decisions. That's... She searched for the right response. Accurate. Sophie said you looked tired. Isabella said nothing for a moment. She wasn't wrong, she said finally. He nodded once, slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already thought. Outside, the rescue vehicle had pulled up on the shoulder. Its headlights lit the rain-wet road in 2 long, pale columns. The driver would be walking up to the car. She had perhaps 3 minutes. I'll have the contract sent to whatever email you give me, she said. My attorney will call to walk you through it. She hesitated, which was not something she typically did at the end of a negotiation. I know this is not what either of us would have chosen. No, he agreed. I will make it as uncomplicated as I can. I keep my word. He looked at her for a long moment, something measuring in it, but not hostile. I believe you, he said, which was not something she'd expected him to say, or something she'd realized she needed to hear until he said it. She gave him her attorney's direct number, wrote her own email on a piece of paper he tore from a notepad on the workbench, and walked out into the thinning rain. She didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. Isabella functioned on less sleep than most human beings could manage without consequences, and she'd always regarded this as an advantage rather than a symptom of anything. Tonight she used the hours productively. She was on the phone with David Cole until 2 in the morning, with her PR team until 3:30, with the attorneys who were drafting the contract until just past 5. Her apartment was on the 34th floor of a building in downtown Savannah that had been designed by an architect who believed that empty space was itself a form of luxury. The ceilings were 12 feet high. The floors were white marble. Every surface was clean and deliberate and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they cost enough money and no one is touching them. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at the city lights while she talked, and she thought about Ethan Brooks standing at his workbench holding a piece of sandpaper, and Sophie Brooks asleep on a three-legged stool with her hand reaching out for a picture book in her sleep. She thought about the question he'd asked that she hadn't been prepared for. What happens to the people who work for you? Not what happens to your money, not what happens to your power. The people. She'd been asked that question 100 times in 100 interviews and 100 boardrooms, and she'd always answered it with the kind of fluency that comes from having a very polished answer ready. Something about stewardship, something about responsibility, something that sounded meaningful without costing her anything to say. Ethan Brooks had asked it in a woodworking shop, covered in sawdust, in a flannel shirt, and it had landed completely differently. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched the city. The wedding was at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was not a wedding. She refused to call it that in her head, even as she was standing in the clerk's office at Chatham County with David Cole on one side and a woman from her PR team on the other, watching Ethan Brooks walk in through the door in a sport coat that looked like he'd found it in a hurry, which, given the timeline, was entirely possible. He had Sophie with him. Isabella hadn't expected that. She'd assumed he'd arrange for someone to take her, but Sophie walked in beside her father in a dress with a yellow collar and her hair in two uneven pigtails, clearly self-done, and looked around the clerk's office with the interested calm of a child who has been brought to an adult place and is making the most of it. She spotted Isabella and her face opened up. "You're here," she said, as if they were old friends reuniting rather than people who had met in a rainstorm approximately 14 hours ago. "Your shoes are clean now." "They are," Isabella agreed. She had worn different shoes. The Manolos were in a bag in her car, probably unsalvageable. "I like your dress." "It has a bow in the back," Sophie informed her. "Daddy tied it, but it came out weird." She turned around to demonstrate. The bow was objectively somewhat lopsided. "It looks fine," Isabella said. Ethan reached her a moment later. He looked at her with that same level, careful expression she was already beginning to recognize. The one that did not reveal very much, but was not attempting to conceal very much either. It was just how his face operated when he was processing something significant. "You okay?" he said quietly. It was, she thought, a strange thing for him to ask. She was the one who had engineered this situation. She was the one who had shown up at his door. She was the one whose billion-dollar future hung on the next 40 minutes. "Fine," she said. "You don't look fine. I look fine." "You're doing the thing with your jaw," he said, "where you're holding it very still because you're trying to look calm." She stared at him. "You've known me for less than 12 hours. "The jaw thing is hard to miss." He said it without any particular emphasis. Not unkind, not teasing, just matter of fact, the way he seemed to be about most things. She deliberately relaxed her jaw. "Better," he said. David Cole appeared at her elbow with a look that communicated approximately 11 different things, all urgent. Isabella excused herself and stepped aside for 3 minutes of whispered legal briefing. When she came back, Ethan was crouched down next to Sophie, adjusting one of her pigtails with the focused care of a man who had done this 1,000 times and knew he was still not very good at it. Sophie was telling him something about the picture book she'd been reading the previous night, something about a fox who kept getting lost but always found his way home. "The fox is very determined," she was explaining seriously. "He doesn't give up even when things are hard." "Good quality in a fox," Ethan said. "In a person, too," Sophie said, and glanced at Isabella with what seemed like entirely intentional significance for a 7-year-old. Isabella looked away. The ceremony took 11 minutes. A clerk named Robert, who had the demeanor of a man who had witnessed every possible human circumstance across a long career and had made his peace with all of it, led them through the words with quiet efficiency. He didn't remark on the legal team standing in the back, or the PR consultant with her phone held slightly too ready, or the 7-year-old sitting in a plastic chair making a drawing of what appeared to be a fox. When it came to the rings, which her team had sourced in 3 hours that morning, a plain gold band for each of them, nothing elaborate. Ethan took hers from David and put it on her finger. His hands were warm. She noticed that. There was a small scar on the back of his right hand, pale against the skin, that she hadn't seen in the workshop's dim light. She noticed that too. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Robert said, in the same voice he probably used to announce weather conditions, and it was done. The PR consultant started typing. David made a phone call. Outside in the hallway, something was already happening on a news wire. Ethan looked at Isabella. She looked at him. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. There was nothing in the room that addressed this particular situation. The silence between two strangers who had just legally bound themselves to each other for reasons neither of them would have chosen, and both of them understood completely. Sophie appeared between them, looking up at each of them in turn. "Do we have to go now?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Okay." She considered this. Then she reached out and took one of Isabella's hands. Just took it, casually, the way children reach for things that interest them without calculating whether they should. Isabella felt the small fingers close around hers, and something happened in her chest that she didn't immediately have a category for. "Daddy," Sophie said, reaching for his hand too. "Can we get pancakes?" Ethan looked over the top of Sophie's head at Isabella. "Do you eat pancakes?" he asked. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a pancake. She thought it might have been sometime in her early 20s, before mornings became something she spent on her phone before she was fully awake. "Yes," she said. "Okay," Sophie said, satisfied. "Then it's a good day." She walked them both toward the door, one hand in each of theirs. Isabella Sterling, whose name was about to be on every news wire in the country, who had just saved her empire with an 11-minute ceremony and a plain gold band, let a 7-year-old girl lead her out of a county clerk's office by the hand. And she thought, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, that Sophie Brooks might be the first person in years who had taken her hand without wanting anything from it. The door opened. The Savannah morning was bright and already warm. The storm of the night before washed completely away. And somewhere out in the city, Isabella's phone was ringing with the first of what would be hundreds of calls she'd need to take before the day was over. She didn't reach for it yet. She walked out into the light with her hand in Sophie's and let the morning happen for exactly 1 more minute. Then she reached for her phone. The day had already begun. The pancakes were from a place called Deli's, 3 blocks from the courthouse, with sticky laminated menus and a waitress named Greta who called everyone Han and refilled coffee without being asked. It was not the kind of place Isabella Sterling typically ate breakfast. The last time she'd had a sit-down meal that wasn't a business lunch or a catered event, she couldn't precisely remember. But Sophie had walked them both through the door with the confidence of a regular customer, climbed into the booth by the window, and announced that Deli's had the best blueberry pancakes in Savannah and possibly the world. "We come here on Saturdays," Sophie told Isabella, arranging the sugar packets into a small pyramid. "Daddy always gets the same thing." "Eggs and toast," Ethan confirmed, sitting across from his daughter, and not quite across from Isabella, who had ended up beside Sophie in a way that had happened organically and felt slightly surreal. "Sophie thinks this is boring." "It is boring," Sophie said. "You could get the chocolate chip ones." "I don't want the chocolate chip ones." "Isabella, tell him." Isabella looked at the menu. "The blueberry ones do look better than the eggs." Ethan looked at her over his menu with an expression that said he was mildly surprised she'd taken a side, but wasn't opposed to it. 2 against 1, Sophie announced. "You have to get the fun ones." "That's not how voting works," Ethan said. "It's how breakfast voting works." He ordered the eggs and toast. Sophie looked personally betrayed. Greta refilled Isabella's coffee and winked at her in a way that suggested she found the whole table charming, which Isabella filed away under things that don't usually happen to me. She ordered the blueberry pancakes because she'd said she would, and also because she hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 7 the previous morning, and her body was beginning to make its displeasure known in very direct terms. Outside the window, Savannah went about its Tuesday business. Pedestrians, delivery trucks, a man walking a dog that appeared to be some elaborate crossbreed of 3 incompatible species. Her phone had rung 4 times since they'd sat down. She'd let all 4 go to voicemail, which was not a thing she did, ever. And the sensation of watching calls accumulate without answering them was mildly physical, like something pressing against the inside of her sternum. But Sophie was telling her about the Fox book, and the pancakes, when they came, were genuinely excellent. And Ethan was watching his daughter talk with the particular quality of attention that Isabella had noticed in the workshop: present, complete, unhurried. Like Sophie was the most interesting thing in any room she happened to be in, which Isabella was beginning to think she probably was. They ate breakfast. The morning moved around them. It was for 40 minutes nearly normal. Then David Cole called for the fifth time, and Isabella excused herself and stepped outside, and the day she'd actually been bracing for finally arrived. The story had broken at 9:47 a.m. while they were still in the clerk's office. By the time they finished breakfast, it had been picked up by 43 news outlets. By early afternoon, the words Isabella Sterling and secret marriage were sitting at the top of trending searches in 6 states. The photos were inevitable. Someone outside the courthouse had been faster than her PR team had anticipated, and there were 3 images circulating: Isabella and Ethan walking out, Ethan's hand briefly at the small of her back in the unconscious way of someone guiding another person through a door, and one that her publicist described, somewhat grimly, as unfortunately very convincing, in which Sophie had been caught mid-stride between them, holding one hand each, looking up at something one of them had said and laughing. The caption on that one read, "Sterling surprise billionaire CEO, secretly weds and becomes a stepmom?" Isabella read it in the back of her car on the way back to the penthouse and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, not distress. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with the gap between the photograph and the reality, and the strange, unsettling fact that the photograph looked like something real. Her phone rang. She answered it. Gerald Whitmore's voice came through, smooth and controlled and only barely containing what she recognized as fury. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you, Gerald." "This was very creative." "I don't know what you mean," she said pleasantly. A pause. "You know this isn't over." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean by that either." She looked out the car window at Savannah passing by. "Was there something specific you needed, or did you call to extend your well wishes?" He hung up. She set the phone down and pressed her fingers briefly against her closed eyes. It wasn't over. Of course it wasn't. Gerald Whitmore hadn't been assembling a board coalition for 3 weeks because he intended to give up cleanly. He would probe. He would look for cracks. If this marriage didn't look real, if it looked like exactly what it was, he would find a way to use it, and then she'd have a different crisis with the same consequences. Which was how, by Thursday of that week, Ethan Brooks and his daughter moved into Isabella Sterling's penthouse. She had not planned for this. Or rather, she had planned for it in the abstract. Her attorneys had flagged the possibility that living separately would be a liability. But she had not planned for what it would actually look like when Ethan arrived with 2 large duffel bags, a toolbox, a cardboard box of Sophie's things, and a child who walked into the 34th floor penthouse, looked up at the 12-foot ceilings, and said, in a voice of tremendous awe, "It's like living inside a cloud." Ethan looked around the apartment. He said nothing for a moment. Isabella watched him take in the white marble and the floor-to-ceiling glass in the kitchen that had been designed by someone who had very strong opinions about negative space. "It's very clean," he said finally. "Thank you." That wasn't entirely a compliment. "I know." He set the toolbox down on the marble floor, and it made a sound that rang through the apartment like a bell. Sophie was already at the windows, pressing her palms flat against the glass and looking down at the city below with the fearlessness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of heights. "I can see everything," she announced. "Daddy, I can see the river." "Don't lean on the glass, Bug." "I'm not leaning, I'm pressing." "There's a difference?" Isabella asked. In her mind, yes, Ethan said. They stood there for a moment, the 3 of them, in the enormous clean silence of Isabella's apartment, and Isabella had the sudden acute awareness that she had not had another person's belongings in this space since she'd moved in 3 years ago. She had hosted dinners here, carefully managed events with caterers and guest lists and everything arranged at a precise remove. She had not had someone's toolbox on her floor. She had not had a child's handprints on her windows. She found she didn't immediately know what to do with either. "I had the guest wing prepared," she said, which was how she referred to the east side of the apartment, which had its own bathroom and a separate sitting room. "There's a room that can be Sophie's, I had some things brought in this week, some furniture, some... She stopped, because Ethan had turned to look at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not quite suspicion, something more like careful attention being paid to an unexpected detail. You had things brought in, he repeated. A bed, some shelves. I wasn't sure what she... Isabella heard herself, understood why she was stopping. I didn't want her to feel like she was staying in a hotel. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he called Sophie away from the window. Want to see your room? He asked her. I get my own room? Looks like it. Sophie turned to Isabella with an expression of undisguised delight. Can I see? Isabella led them down the hall. She had not truthfully known exactly what to do with the room. She'd called Priya on Tuesday morning and said she needed a child's bedroom put together by Thursday, and Priya, who was both deeply efficient and used to operating without full context, had arranged it. There was a bed with a blue headboard. There were shelves along one wall. On one shelf, because Isabella had thought of it separately from Priya's arrangements and made one call herself, there was a small collection of picture books, maybe a dozen, chosen without any particular expertise, and on top of them, a stuffed fox. She had seen the fox book in the workshop. She had thought about it on the drive back. It had seemed like the right thing. She wasn't sure it was. Sophie walked into the room and stopped. She looked at the fox. She looked at Isabella. You got a fox, she said, very quietly, as if she was making sure it was real. I wasn't sure if you already had one, Isabella said. If you do, you can have two. Sophie picked it up. She held it against her chest and looked up at her father. Ethan was looking at Isabella. Something had shifted in his expression, something she couldn't precisely name, a slight softening around the edges of that careful, guarded quality. Thank you, Sophie said, still holding the fox. You're welcome, Isabella said. It came out more quietly than she intended. The first week was the most difficult. Not because of any single dramatic crisis, though those existed. It was the accumulated friction of two completely different ways of living colliding inside one very expensive apartment. Ethan cooked, which Isabella had not anticipated, not just competently, but with what she recognized as genuine skill, taking over her kitchen on the second night and producing something with chicken and roasted garlic that made the apartment smell like something entirely unfamiliar, warm and domestic and slightly overwhelming. He and Sophie ate at the kitchen table with plates and conversation and the ordinary small arguments about whether Sophie had to eat her broccoli, and Isabella stood in the doorway in a suit she hadn't changed out of yet, at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, and felt strangely like she was looking at something through a window. Are you going to stand there or eat? Ethan said, without looking up. I have calls at 8. That's 20 minutes. Sit down. She sat down. Ethan served her without asking what she wanted, which was mildly presumptuous, and also meant she didn't have to make a decision, which she realized after the fact she'd needed. Sophie talked for most of the meal about her school and a best friend named Phoebe and a class hamster named Governor, whom she clearly considered both a personal acquaintance and a minor celebrity. Isabella ate the chicken, which was very good, and contributed enough to the conversation to not feel like a guest in a restaurant. And by the end of it, something in her shoulders had dropped about an inch. She made her 8 o'clock call from the study. When she came out at 9:30, the kitchen was clean, and Sophie was in her room, and the apartment was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of a place where people were sleeping. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. There was a plate covered in foil on the counter with her name on it, on a post-it note, in handwriting that was slightly cramped and entirely legible. Isabella, in case you didn't eat enough. E. She lifted the foil. More chicken, a piece of bread. She stood at her kitchen counter at 9:30 on a Thursday and ate cold chicken over the sink, and the experience was so completely at odds with every other part of her life that she wasn't sure how to catalog it. She ate all of it. The professional pressure in those first weeks was immense and came from every direction. The board hadn't fully backed down. Whitmore was quiet, but quiet in the way of someone repositioning rather than retreating. 2 journalists from different outlets attempted to contact Ethan directly, which her PR team intercepted, but which left Ethan with a tightness around his jaw that she recognized as suppressed irritation. A gossip publication ran a piece headlined, Who is Ethan Brooks? Everything we know about Sterling's mystery. Husband, which was mostly accurate, mildly invasive, and included a photograph of his workshop that someone had taken from the street. When she showed him, he read it without expression. They got the square footage wrong, he said. I'm sorry, it's fine. He set the phone down. It's not fine, but it's manageable. I knew what I was agreeing to. If you want me to have legal send a cease and desist, Isabella. He looked at her. I'm okay. I'm not going to break. She believed him. That was the thing she kept running into with Ethan Brooks. He was simply steadier than she expected, steadier than most people she dealt with, and not in a performed way. Not the steadiness of someone trying to appear unshakable, just someone who had already been through the worst thing that could happen to him and had come out the other side still standing, still functional, still making dinner and fixing Sophie's pigtails and showing up. His wife had been named Kara. Isabella found this out not from asking directly, but from a combination of things, a name Sophie mentioned twice, a photograph on the shelf in the guest room where Ethan had put some of their own things, a reference he made once when they were talking about something else. He didn't avoid the subject, but he also didn't open it. It existed in the space around him the way grief does when it's been lived with long enough to become integrated rather than overwhelming. She didn't ask. It wasn't her territory. But she thought about it sometimes, in the way you think about the shape of something you can't see directly. The blanket fort happened in the third week. She came home from a particularly brutal board meeting, 3 hours, Whitmore circling with procedural challenges, 2 abstentions that should have been supportive votes, a headache that had started at 10 a.m. and was still going at 6 p.m., and walked into her living room to find that it no longer existed in any recognizable form. What had been there? White sofas, glass coffee table, a very carefully chosen abstract painting her interior designer had selected, negative space as luxury. What was there now? An enormous structure of blankets and sofa cushions, and what appeared to be 4 dining chairs deployed as load-bearing walls, with a reading lamp inside creating an orange glow that seeped out through the blanket seams and turned the whole thing into something resembling a very small, very domestic sunrise. From inside the structure, Sophie's voice. We're a village. Ethan's voice, slower, the voice of someone who has been in the village long enough to be slightly tired but not remotely sorry about it. We're a village. What village? Isabella said. A pause. Then Sophie's face appeared through a gap in the blankets. Fox Village. You can come in if you want. Bring the fox. Isabella stood in her white marble apartment in her work suit with her headache and her ruined afternoon and looked at the blanket fort. I have a call at... She started. It can wait, Ethan said from inside the village. She couldn't see him, just the blanket shifting slightly with his voice. It really can't. 20 minutes, he said. When's the last time you did nothing for 20 minutes? She could not answer this honestly. She tried to think of the last time she had been horizontal and not asleep and not on her phone, and she genuinely could not locate the memory. Go change your clothes, Ethan said. The village has a dress code. What's the dress code? Not a suit, Sophie said. She stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. She went and changed her clothes. She came back in jeans and a sweater, carrying the stuffed fox from Sophie's room because Sophie had asked for it specifically. She crouched down and negotiated the blanket entrance, which was lower than it looked and required a dignity-compromising maneuver, and found herself inside a structure that smelled like warm blankets and was lit by 1 reading lamp and contained Ethan Brooks cross-legged with a book he wasn't reading, and Sophie arranging a series of small toys into what she called the village council. Isabella sat down on the floor. The carpet was softer than she remembered. She leaned back against one of the chair legs and looked up at the blanket ceiling. This is structurally questionable, she said. I reinforced the northeast corner, Ethan said. With what? A dictionary. That's worse. It's working, Sophie handed her the fox. You're the village ambassador, she said seriously. The ambassador holds the fox. What does the ambassador do? Mostly just sits there. But it's an important job. Isabella held the fox. She sat on the floor of a blanket fort in her own living room, and outside the evening went dark, and somewhere on the 34th floor of a Savannah high-rise, for approximately 25 minutes, Because it ran over. She did nothing. Her headache eased. She didn't notice it leaving. She just noticed, at some point, that it was gone. Ethan noticed her noticing. She caught him watching her at one point, not intrusively, just with that particular quality of attention. She looked back at him. There was something in the exchange that she filed away without examining immediately, the way you put something in a pocket to look at later. Later, after Sophie was in bed and the village had been partially dismantled, Ethan insisted on leaving the northeast corner for Sophie to take down herself in the morning, which Isabella found both impractical and surprisingly touching. They stood in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. It was the first time they'd been alone, really alone, without phones or lawyers or immediate crises requiring management. "How was the meeting today?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like an opening. "Bad." She hadn't planned to say it that plainly. "Whitmore is patient. He's more patient than I gave him credit for." "What does he want?" "Control of Sterling Global, which means control of the assets, which means a restructuring that would—" She stopped. "It would undo 20 years of work, 14,000 jobs. My grandfather built that company from 15 employees and a line of credit. I rebuilt it when my father—" She stopped again. Ethan poured the water. He handed her a mug. "When your father what?" he said. She looked at the mug for a moment. She didn't talk about her father. She had a very effective policy of not talking about her father, built over years and enforced consistently. "My father ran Sterling Global for 8 years between my grandfather's death and my taking over," she said. "He was not a good steward of it. By the time I had the legal standing to push him out, the company was carrying $900 million in bad debt and 3 ongoing SEC investigations." She paused. "He's been in Florida for 6 years now. He's not in the picture." Ethan was quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the performative kind, just the words, simply placed. "Don't be. I handled it." "You handled it," he said. "That's not the same as it being okay." She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his mug, not looking at her with the slightly aggressive compassion that people sometimes deployed when they wanted her to feel something on their schedule. Just present, available, if she wanted to continue, not demanding that she did. She changed the subject. He let her. But she thought about what he'd said later, lying awake in the enormous silence of her bedroom. That's not the same as it being okay. She'd never separated those two things before. Handling something and it being okay had always been the same category. You handled it, therefore it was okay. The handling was the okaying. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about Ethan Brooks in a woodworking shop at 9 o'clock at night, with his daughter asleep on a stool, sanding a piece of oak with the focused patience of someone who had also, in his own way, handled things. Who knew exactly what it cost? Outside, Savannah was quiet. The river moved in the dark below. The weeks accumulated into a month, and then into something approaching a rhythm. Sophie started at a school closer to the penthouse, and Ethan adjusted his schedule so that the shop opened late twice a week in order to handle drop-offs. He had an employee now, a young guy named Travis who could manage the front end. So the arrangement was inconvenient but not impossible. He took the workshop car, a 10-year-old truck that looked aggressively out of place in the penthouse parking garage, which Isabella had been informed by her building's parking attendant had become a minor ongoing point of amusement. She and Ethan worked out the logistics of the apartment with the practical efficiency of two people who were both fundamentally competent and fundamentally allergic to unnecessary conflict. He cooked most evenings because he liked to cook, and Isabella had already demonstrated a relationship with her kitchen that could be generously described as neglectful. She handled all building staff communication because Ethan found the building staff communications bewildering, particularly the emails about elevator maintenance that ran to 3 paragraphs. They shared the Sunday papers physically, which meant they were sometimes sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen table in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable and had become, without any particular decision being made, simply theirs. He moved some of his tools into the storage room at the end of the hall, and the storage room began to smell like wood, and then occasionally the hallway did too, faintly, when the door was open. She stopped noticing the smell consciously because she had gotten used to it. She noticed one morning, while she was on a call, that she had stopped noticing it, and then she noticed that she didn't mind. The dinner parties were her idea, and she would later not be entirely sure what possessed her to suggest them. Sterling Global had a class of investors who needed managing socially as much as professionally. People who made decisions based on comfort and trust and the feeling of access, and who needed to see Isabella as something other than a quarterly earnings report. A few targeted gatherings at the penthouse, she'd reasoned to David, would go a long way towards stabilizing board sentiment. Show normalcy, show the marriage as integrated, genuine, a life rather than a strategy. David had agreed carefully. What she had not fully calculated was that hosting dinner parties now meant that Ethan was also hosting dinner parties, which was not something she could reasonably ask him to opt out of without creating the exact impression she was trying to avoid. The first one was a Saturday in late October. 8 guests. A caterer she'd used before. Isabella in a dress that cost more than Ethan's monthly workshop lease. Ethan in what she eventually established was the nicest thing he owned. A dark jacket that fit him well enough to suggest it had been bought for a specific occasion, once, a long time ago. He was quiet in crowds in a particular way. Not shy. More like someone who was listening considerably more than he was performing, which in a room full of people who were primarily performing was genuinely noticeable. Gerald Whitmore's wife, who was there through an arrangement Isabella considered strategic and Ethan had not commented on, spent 20 minutes talking to Ethan by the windows, and afterward told Isabella he was refreshingly direct, which was a thing people said about someone who told them the truth when they weren't expecting it. "What did you talk about?" Isabella asked him later, after the guests had gone and they were in the kitchen and Ethan was eating the leftover bread because the caterer's portions had been optimized for aesthetics rather than actual satiety. "Her garden," he said. "She's been trying to grow peonies and they keep dying. I told her they need more drainage and she's probably overwatering." Isabella stared at him. "She's Gerald Whitmore's wife." "I know. You talked to her about peonies." "She asked about peonies. It would have been rude not to answer." He pulled off another piece of bread. "She's not Gerald Whitmore. She's a person who's worried about her peonies." Isabella opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Did she say anything about the board? About Gerald's position on—" "No," Ethan said, "because I didn't ask, because she wanted to talk about peonies." She looked at him for a long moment. He held out the bread. She took it because she was also actually hungry. The caterer's portions had been deeply inadequate, and they ate standing at the kitchen counter, and she thought about the difference between talking to someone because of what they knew and talking to someone because they were standing in front of you, and she thought it was possible she had not done the second thing in a very long time. November came in cold and bright. Sophie turned 8, and Ethan made a cake from scratch that listed slightly to the left and had too much frosting, and Sophie declared it the best cake she had ever eaten, which may have been objectively true or may have been the kind of love that makes everything it touches taste better. Isabella sat at the kitchen table and ate 2 pieces and bought Sophie a new book, a whole series about the fox, which she'd found after spending more time than she'd expected on a children's book website on a Wednesday night. And Sophie had grabbed her around the middle in a hug that caught Isabella completely off guard. Arms around her waist, face pressed into her side, and Isabella had stood there for a moment before she put her hand on the back of Sophie's head and held on. She had not been hugged without agenda in longer than she could specifically recall. She didn't say that. She just held on. Later that night, when Sophie was in bed and the kitchen was quiet and the lopsided cake was mostly gone, Ethan was washing dishes. He had his back to her. She was at the table with a glass of wine she'd barely touched. "Thank you," she said. He turned slightly. "For what?" "The cake. She gestured inadequately at the general shape of the evening. "This." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the dishes. "She likes you," he said. It came out careful, like something he'd decided to say directly rather than dance around. "She's easy to like," Isabella said. "She's 8. She's not easy. She's actually pretty opinionated, and she'll tell you exactly what she thinks about your life choices." He paused. "She told me last week that my truck is embarrassing." "Your truck is a little embarrassing." "It too." He turned off the tap, dried his hands on a dish towel, turned around and leaned against the counter, in the way he always did when a conversation was going to last more than 30 seconds. She's not easy to warm up to strangers. She hasn't been, since her mom. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he handled most things. She warmed up to you fast. Isabella didn't know what to say to this. She was aware of the weight of it, the particular specific weight of what it cost Ethan to say it, and she didn't want to say something that would reduce it. "I'm not sure I know how to be around children," she said finally. "I'm figuring it out as I go." "Yeah," he said. "I can tell." "Is that bad?" "No." He picked up his own glass. "She can tell too. She likes that you're figuring it out. It means you're actually trying, not just performing." Isabella thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. She lay in her enormous bedroom in her enormous apartment, and she thought about Sophie sleeping down the hall with the stuffed fox and the books about the determined fox who always found his way home. And she thought about Ethan in the room between them, which was the guest room, and had his toolbox on the floor and his one photo of Kara on the shelf, and probably his own version of sleeplessness that she hadn't asked about and he hadn't offered. She thought about the gap between performing and trying. She had been performing at some version of her life, at some version of herself. For so long, she wasn't entirely sure she could locate where the performance had started and the actual thing had begun, or if the actual thing was still there at all underneath it. She stared at the ceiling. The city made its distant sounds below. November pressed cold against the glass. She was 40 days into a marriage that was not a marriage, living with a man she barely knew and a child who had decided to trust her, and something was shifting in her chest in a way she didn't have language for yet. Something slow and structural, like the way ground shifts before anyone notices an earthquake has begun. She wasn't ready to name it. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and listened to the apartment breathe around her, the small, unmistakable sounds of a place that was no longer empty. And sleep came eventually, softer than usual, like something that had been standing outside for a long time and had finally decided to come in. December arrived the way it always does in Savannah, not with the dramatic cold snap of northern cities, but with a slow, creeping chill that settled into the mornings and stayed there. The Spanish moss going still on the oaks, the river taking on a darker color, the city pulling its collar up without quite admitting it was cold. The penthouse caught the winter light differently than it had in October, longer shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon going gold earlier and fading faster. And Isabella noticed this because she was, for the first time in years, actually home during the afternoons occasionally, which was new enough to still register. The rhythm of the apartment had changed again without any single decision being made. Sophie had acquired a second stuffed animal, a rabbit she'd named Gerald, which Ethan found mildly hilarious for reasons he explained to Isabella in a low voice one evening. And Isabella had to press her lips together to keep from laughing because Gerald Whitmore was currently her most serious professional adversary, and the idea of him being immortalized as a stuffed rabbit by an 8-year-old felt like a specific kind of justice. Sophie had arranged Gerald and the fox on her shelf in what she called their important positions, and she'd also started leaving her school things on the kitchen table, and her shoes by the door, and her drawings on the refrigerator, which Isabella had not planned for and did not remove. She'd told Priya to order a set of proper refrigerator magnets. Priya had not asked why. The professional landscape that December was a sustained, grinding pressure that never quite resolved into open confrontation. Whitmore had gone quiet in a way that David Cole described as strategic regrouping, and Isabella described as loading the gun somewhere I can't see it. 2 board members who had been reliable votes in her favor had suddenly become unreachable, not hostile, just unavailable, which was its own kind of message. A financial journalist she'd worked with productively for years published a piece questioning whether Isabella's marriage had affected her decision-making at Sterling Global, citing no specific decisions but deploying the kind of language that left impressions without making falsifiable claims. She read the piece at 6 in the morning in the kitchen with her first coffee, before anyone else was awake. Then she read it again. Then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with her hands around her mug and breathed through it, because losing her composure alone in a kitchen at 6 a.m. was not something she intended to do. Ethan came in 20 minutes later in a gray sweatshirt and bare feet and the squinting, not quite there expression of someone who needed coffee before they could fully inhabit their face. He registered her immediately, the set of her shoulders, the phone face down, and said nothing, just moved to the coffee maker with the directness of a man who understood that some situations required caffeine before they required conversation. He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, sat down. "Bad news," he said. Not a question. "A journalist suggested my marriage has compromised my professional judgment." Ethan turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. "Has it?" She looked at him sharply. "I mean it as an actual question," he said, meeting her eyes. "Not a challenge. Has it?" She sat with that for a moment. The honest answer was more complicated than she wanted it to be. Her judgment at Sterling Global was as sharp as it had ever been. She was certain of that. But her judgment about other things, smaller things, the 100 daily micro-decisions that made up a life, what to eat, when to stop working, whether to sit on the floor of a blanket fort, those had shifted. Those were different now. "Not professionally," she said. He nodded slowly. But nothing. You started to say but. I didn't finish the sentence. You didn't have to." He drank his coffee. Outside, the early light was coming in pale and thin through the eastern windows. "It's okay if living here has changed some things. That doesn't make you compromised. That just makes you a person." She looked at him. "You say that like it's simple." "It is simple. You're making it complicated." "Everything in my life is complicated." "Sure," he said, "but not everything needs to be." He stood up, because Sophie could be heard stirring down the hall, and mornings had their own gravity in this apartment now, their own pull toward the ordinary. "The journalist is wrong about your judgment. He's probably fishing for a reaction. Don't give him one." "I know that." "I know you know that." He picked up his mug. "I'm just saying it out loud so you can hear it from somewhere other than inside your own head." He went down the hall to get Sophie moving, and Isabella sat at the kitchen table in the early morning and turned her phone back over and decided not to respond to the article, which she had already known was the right move and which somehow required less effort to commit to now that someone had said it out loud from somewhere other than inside her own head. It was around this time that she began to notice things about Ethan that she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let herself notice, which was a different problem. She noticed the way he moved through the workshop when she came by once to drop off something Sophie had left in the car, the unhurried precision of it, hands knowing exactly where things were, the physical confidence of someone entirely at home in their own competence. She noticed the way he talked to Travis, his employee, without any of the management performance she was accustomed to in her own world, just direct, specific, occasionally asking Travis's opinion on something and then actually using it. She noticed at the second dinner party in December that he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that operated mostly under the surface of conversations, small, precise observations delivered without fanfare, and that 3 separate guests laughed at things he said while appearing slightly surprised to have done so. She noticed that he smelled like wood and coffee in the mornings, and like wood and something cooler in the evenings. And she noticed that she had noticed this, and then she spent 2 days not particularly looking at him, which he either didn't register or chose not to comment on. She was not naive about what was happening. She was 30 years old, not 17. She understood attraction, she understood proximity, she understood the particular chemistry of shared domestic life, and what it did to the barriers people built between themselves and other people. She had a contract and a timeline, and 14,000 employees and a board of directors and a professional adversary who was looking for any crack in her armor, and she did not have the luxury of feelings that weren't on the agenda. She told herself this while she was falling asleep, more than once. It worked, partially. What complicated things was that Ethan was not trying to be anything other than what he was. He wasn't performing, he wasn't angling, he made dinner because food needed to be made. He asked how her day was because he wanted to know, in the same way he asked Sophie how her day was, with genuine attention, ready to listen to the actual answer. He fixed a loose hinge on the bathroom door without mentioning it, and she only discovered he'd done it when she noticed the door stopped sticking, and when she brought it up, he'd said, "It was annoying," and that was the entire conversation. He was careful with her space without being distant. He was present without being invasive. He had figured out, somehow, without her having explained it, because she would never have explained it, that she sometimes needed silence and sometimes needed the opposite, and he'd calibrated himself accordingly, which was something she didn't know how to account for. The fight, when it came from that exact place. It was a Wednesday night in the second week of December, and she'd been in back-to-back calls since 7 in the morning and had missed Sophie's winter performance at school, which she'd said she would try to attend and then hadn't, because a call with a Singapore investment group had run 40 minutes over, and by the time she was free, the performance was done, and Sophie was home with a program she'd saved for Isabella and a careful, studied expression that was trying not to be disappointed and not entirely succeeding. Ethan had not said anything that evening. He'd made dinner, they'd eaten, Sophie had gone to bed, but there was a quality to the silence afterward, when they were in the kitchen, that was different from their usual silence. Not comfortable, weighted in a way she could feel. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm not thinking anything particular." "Ethan?" He set down the dish he was drying, turned to face her, leaning back against the counter in that way he had, arms crossed, but not defensively, more like he was holding himself still. "She saved you the program," he said. "I know." "She told her teacher her mom was coming." Isabella felt the word land. Not stepmother, not her dad's wife. Her teacher. Mom. "I didn't know she said that," Isabella said quietly. "I know you didn't." He picked up the dish again, put it away, the small, deliberate action of someone channeling something into a task. "I'm not blaming you for missing it. Things run over. That happens." But she's 8. He turned back. "And she's starting to count on you, and that means when something doesn't happen, it lands harder than it used to." Isabella felt something tighten in her chest. "I have obligations that—" "I know you do. I knew what your life was when we made this arrangement." His voice was level, not cold, not angry, just deliberate. "But I need you to understand that Sophie doesn't fully understand the arrangement. To her, you're just—" He paused, finding the words carefully. "You're just someone who lives here and eats dinner with us and reads with her on Sunday mornings. She doesn't have context for the rest of it." "You think I should pull back," Isabella said. Her voice was careful. "I think you need to decide what you're doing," he said, "because right now you're in, and I need to know if you're actually in, because she is." The silence between them was long enough to be uncomfortable. "That's not a fair thing to ask me," Isabella said finally. "No," he agreed. "It's not. But Sophie's 8, and she can't ask it herself, so I'm asking it." Isabella looked at the refrigerator. Sophie's drawings were there. 3 of them, clipped with the magnets Priya had ordered. A fox. A tall building. 3 stick figures, 2 large and 1 small, labeled in Sophie's handwriting with extreme specificity. Daddy, Isabella, me. She looked at those stick figures for a long moment. "I'll be at everything from now on," she said. "Whatever can be moved gets moved. Whatever can't, I'll tell her in advance so she's not waiting." Ethan watched her. "That's not a small thing," he said, "in your life." "I know what it is in my life." Something shifted in his expression. The careful guardedness easing, not disappearing, but making room. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. It wasn't resolved exactly, in the way that things between 2 people who are figuring each other out don't resolve so much as they deposit themselves into the ongoing record of what you know about someone, the way you know them, the way you're learning to account for them. But something had been said honestly, on both sides, and the apartment felt less pressurized when she went to bed, and the next morning she'd rearranged 3 meetings and sent Priya a new standing instruction about Sophie's school calendar. Priya, who was very professional and did not ask personal questions, had said only "understood" and updated the system immediately. What Isabella had not anticipated, and what she could not have predicted because she had no reference point for it, was how much Sophie's easy, frank affection would quietly dismantle things in her that she hadn't known were standing. She had grown up in a house where affection was conditional and expressed indirectly, calibrated to performance and outcome. Her grandfather had loved her genuinely, but through the language of expectation and achievement. Her father's version of love had been mostly self-referential. Her mother had left when Isabella was 11 and maintained a cordial, distant relationship that communicated very clearly that some departures are permanent even when they're technically ongoing. Sophie held her hand in parking lots as a reflex. Sophie climbed next to her on the couch without asking and pressed a warm, solid weight against her side and watched whatever was on television with the democratic interest of someone for whom everything was potentially interesting. Sophie told her things, not important things necessarily, just things, the daily accumulation of an 8-year-old's world, what Phoebe said, what Governor the hamster did, why the substitute art teacher was better than the regular art teacher, why she'd decided the fox's name was Raymond. "Why Raymond?" Isabella asked once. "He looks like a Raymond," Sophie said, as if this were obvious, and Isabella had turned away to hide something that was threatening to become a smile too large for the moment. She found herself holding the shape of these small things during board meetings, turning them over in her mind like objects in a pocket, the way you reach for something familiar when everything else is hostile. She had never had anything like this to carry into difficult rooms. She hadn't known it was possible to miss the sound of someone else's life while you were sitting in a boardroom defending your own. Ethan's aunt Catherine Sterling, Isabella's aunt technically through her grandfather, appeared at the penthouse unannounced on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December, and this was the moment when the story stopped being only about a board and a clause and a marriage and became about something more dangerous. Catherine Sterling was 63, the younger sister of Harrison Sterling by 7 years, and she had spent most of her adult life at what Isabella had always considered a careful, dignified remove from the family business, involved enough to attend events and cash dividends, detached enough to maintain the posture of someone above the fray. She was thin and well-dressed in the specific way of women who have been thin and well-dressed for so long it no longer registers as effort, and she had a quality of stillness that Isabella had always found slightly unsettling, like water that isn't moving because something underneath is holding it in place. The building staff called ahead, which gave Isabella 40 seconds to understand that Catherine was in the elevator before she walked through the door. That was not enough time. "Isabella." Catherine came in with the ease of someone who had decided in advance that she was welcome. She looked around the apartment in a slow, measured sweep that was too practiced to be casual. "You've redecorated." "I haven't," Isabella said. "This is how it's always been." Catherine's eyes found the drawings on the refrigerator. The fox, the building, the 3 stick figures. Something moved through her expression briefly, like a shadow passing over water. "I heard you had guests." "I'm married," Isabella said. "My husband and his daughter live here. You knew that." "Of course." She moved into the living room as if invited, which she had not been. "I wanted to see it for myself. We haven't had a chance to speak since the announcement." "You could have called." "I wanted to see your face," Catherine said simply. They sat, because Catherine sat, and Isabella was not going to stand over her like a guard, in the living room where the blanket fort had been, in the clean light of a December afternoon. Catherine had taken the chair that faced the windows. Isabella sat on the sofa across from her. "How is your mother?" Catherine asked. "I don't know. We don't speak." "No, you wouldn't." Catherine looked at her hands, folded in her lap. "Harrison worried about that, you know. At the end, he worried about what would happen to you when he was gone." "He left me the company," Isabella said. "That was what he thought would happen to me." "Yes." Catherine looked up. Her eyes were the same pale gray as Harrison Sterling's, which Isabella had always found disorienting. "And then he put that clause in the will, which is interesting, isn't it? A man who spent 60 years building a company, choosing to put its future on the condition of his granddaughter's marital status." She tilted her head slightly. "Unless the point wasn't the marital status. Unless the point was something else." "What do you think the point was?" Isabella asked. Her voice was very neutral. Catherine smiled, and it was a smile that acknowledged the question without answering it. "I think Harrison was worried you were going to spend your life in that company and end up alone in a very clean apartment." She paused. "I think the clause was meant to push you toward something. He could have just said that." "He could have. He didn't." Catherine looked at the refrigerator from across the room, at the drawings, at the 3 stick figures. "Is it real?" she asked. "The marriage." "We're legally married." "That's not what I asked." The silence was pointed. Isabella held Catherine's gaze and did not feel it. I think that's my business, Isabella said. Catherine nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something rather than denied it. She stood, smoothed her jacket, looked around the apartment once more. Gerald Whitmore is not a patient man, despite appearances, she said. He's very good at looking patient, but he's been waiting for something specific. I'd be careful about what you give him. Thank you for the advice. I mean it kindly, Catherine said, and her voice had something in it that might have been genuine. I know we've never been close, Isabella. That was partly me and partly circumstance. But you're the last one left who can actually hold this family together, including whatever version of this family now includes 3 stick figures on your refrigerator. She looked at Isabella directly. Don't let Gerald make you doubt that. She left. Isabella stood in the middle of her living room for a long moment after the door closed, parsing the visit, turning it over. Something about it felt off, in a way she couldn't immediately identify, like a note played correctly but in the wrong key. Catherine had said the right things, in the right tone, but she had also asked 2 questions she hadn't needed to ask if her intentions were purely supportive, and she had looked at those drawings with an expression that Isabella, who spent her professional life reading faces, filed under not what it appears to be. She picked up her phone and called David. Pull everything we have on Catherine Sterling's position in the estate, she said. Board access, holdings, anything she's signed in the last 18 months. Should I ask why? No, Isabella said. Just do it quickly. She hung up. She stood at the window and watched the river in the afternoon light and thought about her grandfather, who had been a difficult man and a brilliant one, who had loved her in the only language he knew and left her a company and a clause and a problem she was still working out the shape of. She was still at the window when Ethan came home with Sophie at 4:30, the door opening with the familiar sounds of Sophie's bag hitting the floor and her shoes being kicked off toward the mat, and her voice carrying that particular after-school energy of someone who has been holding information in all day and now needs to release it. Isabella, Governor escaped today? Isabella turned from the window. What? He got out of his cage during reading time and Phoebe stepped on him, but not really stepped on him, more like almost stepped on him, and then he hid behind the bookshelf for 40 minutes, and Mrs. Reeves couldn't teach anything because everyone was looking for Governor. Sophie dropped her jacket over the back of the kitchen chair, which was her default landing zone for the jacket and had been since day 1. It was the best day. Is Governor okay? He's fine. He looked smug. Ethan came in behind her, caught Isabella's expression, the residue of the afternoon's conversation still visible in it, apparently, and filed it for later with a slight tilt of his head that meant, we'll talk. They talked after Sophie was in bed, in the kitchen, the lights low, the apartment quiet around them. She told him about Catherine's visit. She told him about the feeling that wouldn't settle, the note in the wrong key. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, letting her get through the whole thing before responding. Trust your instinct, he said. My instinct is that she's either genuinely concerned about me or she's positioning for something, and I can't tell which. You usually can tell. I know. She pressed her fingers briefly against her temple. That's what bothers me. Maybe she's both, he said. People usually are. She can be worried about you and also have her own angle. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Isabella looked at him. When did you get good at reading people? I've been in a woodworking shop for 6 years, he said. Customers come in wanting one thing and asking for another constantly. You learn to listen to the gap between what people say and what they need. She considered that. What's the gap in what I say and what I need? He looked at her for a moment in that steady, undeflectable way. Right now, he said, you need someone to tell you you're not wrong to be suspicious, and you need someone to tell you you're going to be okay, and you need both of those things without having to ask for them. She stared at him. You're not wrong to be suspicious, he said, and you're going to be okay. She looked away first. She looked at the table, at her hands on the table, at the grain of the wood that Ethan had noticed once and identified by species in a way that had impressed her more than he knew. Thank you, she said. Her voice came out thinner than she intended. Yeah, he said, which was how he accepted gratitude, without deflecting it but without making more of it than it was. She went to bed and did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and thought about Catherine and Whitmore and the claws and her grandfather, and she thought about Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator, the three stick figures standing together in a child's confident line. And she thought about Ethan sitting across from her in a low-lit kitchen saying, "You're going to be okay," with the straightforward certainty of someone who believed what they were saying. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe it in a way that surprised her, in a way that wasn't professional or strategic or calculated, just a plain, undefended wanting, the kind that comes from somewhere you don't control. That was when she knew something had changed, not when it was convenient, not when it fit the plan, not when she had space and safety for it. Lying in the dark on a Tuesday night in December with Catherine Sterling's face in her memory and Gerald Whitmore's silence pressing in from every direction, she recognized that the thing growing in her chest when Ethan talked to her had a name, and the name was going to be a problem, and she was not ready for it. And it was happening anyway. She turned over. She pressed her face into the pillow. Down the hall, Sophie was asleep with her fox and her rabbit and her books about the fox who never gave up. In the room between, Ethan was, she didn't know, maybe asleep, maybe not, maybe staring at his own ceiling with his own version of the thing that was not on the agenda. She didn't let herself think about that, not yet. What she let herself think was this, that 4 months ago she had been alone in this apartment in a way she hadn't fully recognized as loneliness until it was no longer true, that she had been performing a version of herself that was entirely sufficient for professional success and entirely insufficient for anything else, that a rainstorm and a broken car and a woodworking shop had deposited her inside a life she had never planned for, and the life was complicated and inconvenient and full of mismatched timing and dirty dishes and a stuffed fox named Raymond, and lopsided birthday cakes and conversations in low-lit kitchens that cost her something to have and gave her something she didn't have a word for. She thought about what Ethan had said months ago, on the first night in his workshop, when she'd told him she kept her word. "I believe you," he'd said. She hadn't understood then what it would mean to be believed by someone who didn't need anything from her. She was beginning to understand it now, and that understanding was the most dangerous thing in the room. Outside, December pressed against the glass. The river moved below in the dark. Inside the apartment, 3 people breathed in their separate rooms in the ordinary darkness of a house that had somehow, without any of them planning it, become a home. The documents David Cole sent her arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of January, and Isabella read them twice at her desk before she called him back, which was how she handled information that required her to adjust something fundamental in her understanding of a situation. She read it once to get the facts, and again to get the shape of what the facts meant. The shape was not good. Catherine Sterling had been quietly acquiring proxy voting rights from minor shareholders for 14 months. Not large blocks. Nothing that would trigger disclosure requirements or attract attention from Isabella's legal team under normal monitoring. Small percentages, patient accumulation, the kind of thing that looked like routine estate management from the outside and looked like something else entirely when you mapped it against Gerald Whitmore's board maneuvers over the same period. The timeline matched. Not approximately, precisely. Every significant move Whitmore had made in the previous year had been preceded by 2 to 3 weeks by a corresponding shift in Catherine's proxy holdings. She had been feeding him positioning intelligence. She had been, in effect, building him a platform while maintaining her posture as a concerned family member at a dignified remove. The visit to the penthouse 3 weeks earlier, the careful questions, the thing Isabella had heard in her voice that she hadn't been able to name but had filed under not what it appears to be. She sat at her desk for a long time after she set the documents down. She thought about her grandfather's study, the smell of it, old leather and pipe tobacco, and the specific weight of a room where serious decisions had been made for 60 years. She thought about being 12 years old and sitting across from Harrison Sterling at his desk while he explained to her, in plain and somewhat brutal terms, that the people most capable of damaging you were always the ones close enough to try. She had thought at 12 that this was a cold thing to tell a child. She had grown into someone who understood it as preparation. She had just not expected it to come from this direction. She called David. "How solid is this?" "Solid enough that I've had 2 other attorneys review it," he said. "The proxy chain is real. The timing correlation is... It's not coincidence, Isabella." "No," she said. It's not. What do you want to do? She thought about it. Going to the board directly with this would be complex. Catherine held no official position, which meant her influence operated entirely through Whitmore, which meant any action had to go through him, which meant a confrontation that he'd had months to prepare for. Nothing yet, she said. Keep building the documentation. I want every transaction, every communication we can legally access, everything, and I want it airtight before we move. That could take weeks. Then it takes weeks. She paused. How much does Whitmore need to call the vote? He's close. 2 more commitments, maybe 3. He's been working the edges, the newer board members, the ones who don't have long history with Sterling Global. I know which ones. She'd already identified them. She'd been working them herself quietly for 2 months. Keep me updated. She hung up and sat in the silence of her office on the 28th floor of the Sterling Global building, looking out at Savannah below, and she felt, underneath the calculation and the strategy and the practiced steadiness, a cold, specific anger at Catherine Sterling that she would not let anyone see and that she would not act on before she was ready. She drove home that evening and didn't tell Ethan about Catherine. Not yet. Not because she didn't trust him. That calculation had shifted considerably over the past 2 months in ways she was still adjusting to. But because telling him would make it real in a different way, and she needed a few hours with it alone first. What she did instead was sit on the kitchen floor with Sophie, who was in the middle of what she described as an extremely important art project involving approximately 47 different colors of marker and a piece of cardboard the size of a small door. "What are you making?" Isabella asked. "A map," Sophie said, without looking up. "Of what?" "Everything." She added a green squiggle near the top. "Here's the river. Here's our building. Here's Daddy's shop. Here's Phoebe's house. Here's where we got the pancakes." She pointed to each location with a marker that was leaving faint blue marks on the marble floor, which Isabella decided not to address. "And here's Fox Village." "Fox Village is on the map?" "Fox Village is real," Sophie said firmly. "Real things go on maps." Isabella looked at the map, the sprawling, confident, entirely subjective geography of an 8-year-old's world, with their building drawn bigger than everything else and surrounded by the things that mattered. "Can I be on it?" she asked. Sophie looked at her with mild surprise, as if the question was unnecessary. Then she picked up a red marker and drew a small figure next to the building, next to the existing figures that were presumably her and Ethan. "You were already on it," Sophie said. "I just didn't label you yet." She wrote Isabella in careful letters next to the figure, smaller than she'd have liked but fitting in the available space. She capped the red marker. "You're the ambassador. The ambassador is always on the map." Isabella looked at the small red figure on the cardboard map, labeled in a child's careful handwriting, and felt something in her chest shift with the specific, ungainly weight of something that couldn't be managed into a more convenient shape. She helped Sophie finish the map. They added Deli's pancake restaurant and the school and the park near the river where Ethan took Sophie on weekend mornings. They added a small square labeled Governor's Kingdom for the school hamster. By the time Ethan came home from the shop at 7, the map was spread across the kitchen table, and Sophie was explaining its entire geography with the serious authority of a cartographer presenting to a geographic society. Ethan looked at it, looked at Isabella. "You're labeled," he said. Apparently I was already on it. Something moved in his expression that she filed away without examining. The second week of January was when the media pressure intensified in a way that felt coordinated, which, as she would later confirm, was because it was. 3 separate stories ran across different outlets within 48 hours, all circling the same territory. Questions about the marriage's legitimacy, unnamed sources suggesting it had been arranged for business purposes. One piece that stopped just short of using the word fraud in a way that a careful legal team had clearly designed to stop just short of actionable. The stories named Ethan specifically. One ran a photograph of the workshop with a caption that described him as a struggling small business owner with mounting debts, which was misleading at best and deliberately cruel in the specific way that accurate statistics can be made cruel through selective context. His debts were a business loan, normal and manageable, the kind that half the small businesses in Georgia carried without it meaning anything about the person carrying them. He read the piece on his phone at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and Isabella watched his jaw set, and she recognized the expression because she'd seen it on her own face in mirrors. The particular controlled stillness of someone absorbing something that genuinely stings and refusing to let it show completely. "I'm going to have legal send a correction demand," she said immediately. "The debt characterization is Don't," he said. "Ethan, it's factually misleading. I know what it is." He set the phone down, face up, which was deliberate. If you send a legal demand, it becomes a bigger story. It becomes your billionaire lawyers going after a journalist over something that is technically defensible. They want the reaction. He looked at her. "You told me that, actually. Don't give them what they want." She had said that, about her own situation, 2 months ago. "This is different," she said. "This is about you." "Which is exactly why I'm telling you to leave it." He pushed the phone to the center of the table, creating distance from it. "I'm not made of glass. I can handle a newspaper article. It's not just an article, it's a pattern. This is coordinated. These 3 stories in 48 hours, they're not independent. Someone is feeding." "I know," he said. "I can see that too." He looked at her directly. "And I know you know who." She was quiet. "You've known for a while," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a read. 2 weeks, she said. "I was building documentation before I said anything." "Because you handle things alone." "Because I handle things correctly before I involve other people." "Those aren't the same thing either," he said, which was a callback to something she'd said about her father in November that she hadn't expected him to remember. She should have known he would. He remembered things the way he caught the book in the workshop, without making a show of it, instinctively, because he was paying attention. She told him about Catherine. All of it. The proxy acquisitions, the timeline correlation, the visit, the questions about whether the marriage was real, the note she hadn't been able to name until she had the documentation. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "Your grandfather's sister," he said. "Yes." "Who came here and asked about the drawings on your refrigerator?" "Yes." He was silent for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in its slow circle, which she'd learned was what he did when he was processing something large. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It's a specific kind of bad, when it's family." "It's not." She started the sentence and couldn't finish it the way she'd intended. "It's not a surprise, that was true. It doesn't hurt, that was less true than she wanted it to be. She'd spent 2 weeks telling herself she wasn't surprised, which was not the same thing as not being hurt, and she was beginning to internalize this distinction in a way that was Ethan's influence specifically, she knew, because he'd handed it to her in a sentence about her father months ago, and she'd been carrying it since. "It's fine," she said instead. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was letting that stand without agreeing with it. "What's your move?" he asked. "Documenting everything. When it's airtight, I take it to the board directly and let them decide whether they want to be associated with someone who has been running a 14-month proxy manipulation campaign against the company they govern." "And Whitmore?" "Whitmore falls with Catherine when the mechanism is exposed. He can't call a legitimate vote once the board knows his coalition was built on information fed from inside the family." "How long?" 2, 3 weeks, maybe less." He nodded slowly. Okay, she said. "I thought you might—" She stopped. "Might what?" "Try to talk me into a different approach. Something less confrontational?" He almost smiled. "It's your company. You know the board. I know woodworking. I'm not going to tell you how to manage a corporate crisis." "You've given me advice before." "About your feelings. That's different." He stood, picked up his mug. "On the professional side, you're the expert. I trust you to handle it." She looked at him. The word trust sat in the air between them, plain and direct, and she thought about how rarely anyone had said it to her without a qualifier or a condition or an underlying ask. "Thank you," she said. "Yeah." He rinsed the mug. "Now I have to go be a struggling small business owner with mounting debts." She almost laughed. It came out shorter than a laugh, more like an exhale with some warmth in it, but he heard it and it seemed to be sufficient. The crack appeared 3 weeks later, and it appeared from the direction she had not been watching. She had been watching Whitmore. She had been watching Catherine. She had been managing the board and the media and the documentation and the calendar and Sophie's school events and the apartment and all the moving pieces of a life that had expanded considerably beyond its original parameters. She had been watching everything. She had not been watching herself. It was a Saturday afternoon in late January. Sophie was at Phoebe's house. Ethan was at the workshop. Travis had called in, some kind of family thing, and a client was coming to look at a custom commission. Isabella was home alone, which happened rarely now, and felt different than it used to, the apartment's silence no longer comfortable but merely empty in the specific way of a place accustomed to being occupied. She was on a call with a Hong Kong investment group when the second call came through on her other line. She glanced at it. Marcus. Driver. She declined it and kept talking. Marcus called again 4 minutes later. She declined again. Then her assistant called, which meant something had happened that Priya considered worth interrupting for, and Isabella said to the Hong Kong group, "I need 30 seconds, which was not something she said ever in calls of this importance. She clicked over. "There's something on the wire," Priya said. A statement from a source identified as a Sterling Global insider. "It's... Isabella, it says your marriage is a business arrangement and that you're planning to divorce as soon as the board situation resolves." Everything went very still. "How detailed?" Isabella asked. "Specific enough that it's credible." "Contract timeline." "The terms." Priya's voice was careful, professional, deeply unhappy. "It's been up for 20 minutes. It's moving fast." Isabella closed her eyes, opened them. "Hold on." She clicked back to the Hong Kong call. "I apologize. I have an emergency I need to address. My assistant will reschedule." She ended the call before they'd finished responding and sat in the silence of her apartment for approximately 10 seconds, which was how long it took to understand what was happening and what it meant. The source was either Catherine or someone Catherine had access to. The information, the specific terms of the contract, the timeline, the intent, that information had come from somewhere inside the legal arrangement, which meant either David Cole's office had been compromised or someone had accessed documents they shouldn't have. Both possibilities were serious. The second was potentially criminal. But those were problems for the next hour. The problem for right now was that Ethan didn't know this was coming, and he was going to find out, and she needed to be the one who told him before he found out from a headline. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "There's a story," she said. "It's going everywhere. It says the marriage is a business arrangement." A pause. "How specific?" "Specific." Another pause, longer. "Okay." "Ethan, I'm finishing something with a client," he said. His voice was very level. "I'll be home in an hour." The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand and the apartment around her, empty and white and enormous, and waited for the next hour to happen. He came home at 6. Sophie was back by then, brought home by Phoebe's mother, and the apartment had that after-school energy that Isabella had come to map by sound. Shoes at the door, bag on the chair, Sophie's voice carrying from the hallway. But Sophie read the air in the apartment the way children do when something is wrong between adults, and she went to her room with unusual quietness after dinner, taking Raymond the fox and closing the door with a care that said she understood something without knowing what. Ethan and Isabella sat at the kitchen table. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him everything. The statement, the specific details that had leaked, the probable source, what it meant for the board situation, what it meant for their exposure. She was thorough and precise, and she watched his face while she talked, and what she saw there was more complicated than she'd been prepared for. He wasn't angry, exactly. Or he was, but underneath the anger there was something else. Something more structural, a kind of settling into a conclusion he'd been holding off. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The contract details," he said finally. "Those came from legal files." "Yes." "Which means someone accessed them." "Yes." "We're investigating a..." "But the details themselves, the timeline, the terms, those are accurate." She heard what he was actually saying. "Yes, they're accurate." He nodded slowly. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, the way he braced himself when he was thinking hard about something that cost something to think about. She'd seen this before. She knew what came after it. "This was always the arrangement," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of someone locating himself, finding the ground. "Yes," she said quietly. 6 months, clean exit." He looked up. "We're at month 4. "Ethan, I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because I need to be honest about what's actually been happening." He pressed his palms down on the table. "I got comfortable here. Sophie got comfortable here. And I let that happen I let myself not think about what it means when it ends. It doesn't have to." She stopped herself. He looked at her. "Doesn't have to what?" She was at a choice point and she knew it. And the choice was between saying the thing that was true, the thing that had been growing in her chest since December, that she had named in the dark and had not said aloud to anyone, and protecting herself from the specific vulnerability of saying it out loud in a kitchen where everything could fall the wrong way. She had spent her entire life choosing protection. "Nothing," she said. "I was going to say it doesn't have to be resolved tonight." He studied her. She looked back at him steadily, and she felt the gap between what she'd almost said and what she'd actually said sitting in the air between them like an object, and she thought he could probably feel it too, and she thought he might be doing the same thing, choosing protection, finding the ground, locating himself at a safe remove. "The story will run," he said. "It's already out." "What does that mean for the board?" She walked him through it. More clinical now, both of them. The story was damaging, but not necessarily fatal. The board had more to fear from Catherine's fraud documentation than from questions about the marriage's origins. If she moved in the next week, if she got to the right board members before Whitmore could consolidate. "So you need a few more weeks," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. Something was moving behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read, which was unusual. She had become accustomed to reading him. "Then we have a few more weeks," he said. He got up. He rinsed the glasses and turned off the kitchen light and said goodnight at the hallway in the way he had for months, the brief, ordinary goodnight of two people who had stopped needing to perform normalcy because it had, somewhere along the way, simply become normal. She stood in the kitchen after he'd gone, in the dark, with the shape of the evening settling over her. She knew what she'd heard in that exchange and what she hadn't. She knew that the few more weeks he'd offered had cost him something, that he'd made a choice too, in that kitchen, to stay when the easier thing was to start pulling back. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet, because she had spent all her available energy on every other dimension of this crisis, and she didn't have a reserve left to handle it carefully. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened. Down the hall, Sophie's light was still on, the thin line of it visible under the door. Probably reading. Probably the Fox books, which she'd been rereading in order, which Ethan had explained was her pattern when she was working something out. Isabella stared at the ceiling. The walls she had spent 30 years building were not as solid as they'd been in November. Solid enough still, but different. Load-bearing in some places, decorative in others, and she was no longer certain which was which. Then came the conversation she had replayed more times than she would ever admit. It was 3 days after the leaked story, a Tuesday night, and she had been in the Sterling Global building until 9 p.m. dealing with the fallout from a board member, one of the newer ones, who had called to say he was likely voting with Whitmore's coalition. She'd talked him back from the edge, mostly, but it had taken 2 hours and she'd come home tired in the bone-deep way that wasn't about sleep. Ethan was in the living room, reading. Sophie was in bed. The apartment had the particular quality of late evenings, quieter than silence, lived in. He looked up when she came in. He read her. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "I know. Sit down anyway." She sat. She didn't take off her jacket. She wasn't sure she had the energy. "Good news or bad?" he said. "Both. Shored up Landry's vote. Lost access to Quan. He's not answering." She rubbed the back of her neck. "Catherine is accelerating. Whatever timeline she and Whitmore had, they've moved it up. The leak was supposed to destabilize us before I could move on the proxy documentation, and it partially worked. Partially. I got to Landry. So you're still standing?" "I'm still standing." She looked at him. Barely. He put his book down. He looked at her with the expression that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something true that she might not want to hear. "You know what you need to do," he said. "You've known for 2 weeks. You're waiting because you're not sure it's going to work, and you don't want to move until you're certain, but you're not going to be certain because that's not how this works." She looked at him. "You know nothing about corporate governance." "I know about building things and having them not turn out right, and having to decide whether to tear it down and start over or keep working." He met her eyes. "You have the documentation. Take it to the board. Do it this week. If it's not airtight, Isabella." He said her name with a weight that stopped her. "You have been preparing for this for 3 weeks, and you are as ready as you're going to get. The longer you wait, the more ground Whitmore takes. Move." She stared at him. "I don't take orders," she said, but it came out without edge. "I know," he said. "It's a strongly worded suggestion." She almost smiled. It was tired and slight and didn't quite make it all the way, but it was close. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She went to bed and scheduled the board meeting for Thursday. Wednesday morning, she found a note on the kitchen counter, held down by her coffee mug, in Ethan's cramped, legible handwriting. "You built it once. You can protect it. E." She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She carried it to the board meeting. She kept her hand in her pocket the whole drive over, not touching the note exactly, just aware of its presence there, a weight that was small enough to be easily missed and significant enough to be exactly what she needed. The board meeting on Thursday was 2 hours and 40 minutes long, and it was the most consequential conversation of her professional life, and she was not going to lose it. She presented the proxy documentation, all of it, clean and sourced and cross-referenced in the way that David Cole did things when he understood the stakes. She presented the timeline correlation between Catherine's acquisitions and Whitmore's moves. She presented 3 separate legal opinions on the implications for board governance. She was precise and thorough, and she did not perform emotion, not because she didn't feel any, but because this was not where emotion belonged. Halfway through the presentation, Gerald Whitmore stood up. "This is—" he started. "Sit down, Gerald," said Margaret Holloway, the board's longest-serving member, in a voice that had spent 40 years not tolerating interruptions. "She's not finished." Whitmore sat down. Isabella finished. The room was very quiet when she was done. Then Holloway said, "I'd like to call for an internal investigation into the proxy acquisitions and any communications between parties named in this documentation." "Seconded," said Landry immediately. Whitmore said nothing. His face had the expression of a man watching a structure he'd built for 14 months being dismantled in 40 minutes. It wasn't over. Investigations took time. Legal processes took time. Catherine would retain counsel, and the process would stretch across months before any formal resolution. But the momentum had shifted, and in a boardroom, momentum was everything. The coalition Whitmore had assembled was not built on loyalty. It was built on perceived advantage, and perceived advantage was a thing that evaporated in the face of clear documentation and Margaret Holloway's voice calling for investigations. Isabella drove home. She sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before going up, in the silence of the car, in the fluorescent light that made everything look slightly unreal. It was done. Not finished, not for months, but done in the way that mattered. The ground shifted back toward solid. She thought she would feel more. She felt tired and relieved, and underneath both of those, in the place she'd been trying not to look directly, she felt the thing she'd almost said in the kitchen 4 days ago rising again. Insistent, unscheduled. She went upstairs. Ethan was in the kitchen. Sophie was already in bed. He looked at her face when she came through the door, and something in his own face changed. A quiet, settling relief. "Well?" he said. "Holloway called for an investigation. Whitmore's coalition is going to fracture." She put her bag down. "It worked." He exhaled. Not loudly, just completely. The long breath of someone who has been holding something and can put it down. "Good," he said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the kitchen, and there it was. The thing she had not been watching for, the thing she had not protected herself from in time. the space between them filled with something that was not professional and was not strategic and was not on any contract anywhere, and for one long moment, neither of them moved to close the gap or pretend it wasn't there. Then Ethan said, quietly, "I should check on Sophie." And he moved, and the moment sealed over the way moments do, like water closing over a stone, and everything looked the same on the surface and nothing was exactly the same underneath. She stood in the kitchen alone and pressed her hand flat against the counter, the cool marble surface, solid and cold and real, and tried to locate the ground. She couldn't quite find it, because 3 days later, Ethan left. She had not seen it coming with the clarity she should have, which was her own failure, and she would own that. She had been watching the board and the legal situation and the documentation, and she had not been watching the man in her apartment who had been going quieter for a week and looking at Sophie with the particular expression of someone calculating something difficult. He didn't leave dramatically. There was no explosion, no final confrontation. He told her on a Sunday morning in the kitchen while Sophie was still asleep. "I think Sophie and I need to go back to the house," he said. She looked up from her coffee. "What happened?" Nothing happened. He sat down across from her. "That's sort of the problem." She didn't understand. "I came into this with a plan," he said. 6 months, clean exit. I've spent 4 months telling myself that the plan was still the plan, and—" He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "Sophie called you Mom. Not to your face. To her teacher, to Phoebe's mom, to me once, by accident, and she looked mortified. She's 8, and she's already building something in her head that—" "Ethan, I can't let her finish building it," he said. "Because when the 6 months are done, and we go back to our house, and you go back to your life, what she's built is going to come down, and she's already lost one." His voice shifted, tightened, held. "She's already lost one person she didn't expect to lose. I'm not putting her in the way of that again." Isabella was very still. "And you," he said, quieter, "you've been—" He stopped again, and she watched him working something out, working it out honestly, the way he did everything. "I don't know what you feel. You keep it close. And I've got my own—" He shook his head. "I'm not going to stand here and say things that might not be— that might just be what happens when 2 people share a kitchen for 4 months. I don't trust myself to know the difference right now." "Ethan." She said his name and didn't know what came after it. "The legal situation is handled," he said. "You don't need us here for coverage anymore. And I think—" He looked at the table. "I think if we stay much longer, leaving is going to cost more than either of us are prepared to pay." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Savannah was Sunday morning slow. The river moved. Somewhere down the hall, Sophie was still asleep with Raymond the fox and her map of everything that mattered, and she didn't know yet that the map was about to change. "Okay," Isabella said. It came out barely above a whisper. It was the smallest word she'd said in months. He looked at her, and in his face was something she recognized because she'd felt it in herself. The specific expression of someone choosing the careful thing over the true thing, because the true thing felt too large for the room, because the room didn't have the right conditions, because the costs were too uncertain. She understood it completely. She hated it completely. She sat with both of those things at once and said nothing else. He told Sophie after breakfast. Sophie took it with the uncanny composure of a child who had already prepared herself for things not lasting, who had done this preparation quietly and privately because she was Ethan's daughter and had learned from watching him that you get ready for hard things before they arrive. She asked if she could keep Raymond. She asked if she could say goodbye to Isabella's building. She asked if they were still going to delis on Saturdays. "We can still go to delis," Ethan said. Sophie turned to Isabella. "Will you come sometimes?" Isabella's throat was doing something inconvenient. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes." Sophie nodded. "Okay." She went to her room to pack her things with a dignity that was almost unbearable to witness. Ethan looked at Isabella when Sophie was gone. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "for whatever this costs you." "Don't be," she said, which was what she always said, and she meant it less than she ever had. He nodded. He went to help Sophie pack. 2 hours later, the penthouse was quiet again. White marble and 12-foot ceilings and negative space and the refrigerator with 3 drawings still on it, held by the magnets Priya had ordered, and a map of everything that mattered with Isabella's stick figure labeled in careful red letters. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about the fox that always found his way home. She thought about Sophie's voice. "You were already on it. I just hadn't labeled you yet." She thought about Ethan's note in her jacket pocket. "You built it once. You can protect it." She thought about what she had almost said and hadn't. Then she did what she always did. She picked up her phone and she went to work. And she did not let anyone see that anything had broken. But something had. Something quiet and structural. The kind of break you don't notice until you go to put weight on it and it doesn't hold the way it used to. She had handled it. That was not the same as it being okay. The apartment was the same. That was the thing that kept catching her. It was precisely the same as it had been before October, before the rain, before the woodworking shop, and the landline phone, and the coffee that was black and slightly too hot. Same marble floors, same 12-foot ceilings, same view of the river from the floor-to-ceiling windows that Sophie had pressed her palms against on the first day and said it was like living inside a cloud. Isabella had not moved a single piece of furniture. She had not rearranged anything or reclaimed any space or returned the penthouse to its original configuration. She had not taken the drawings off the refrigerator. She told herself this was because she hadn't gotten around to it. She was busy. The investigation into Catherine's proxy scheme was ongoing. The board was in a period of reconstruction. David Cole was sending her documents at a rate that required a dedicated folder on her desktop. She was busy. The refrigerator was not a priority. This was not entirely true, and she knew it. She was still working 15-hour days, which was normal. She was still making the right decisions at the right times, which David confirmed and the board confirmed, and the financial press was beginning to confirm in pieces that ran with words like resilient and decisive. She was handling it. She was always handling it. But she was doing it in an apartment that still smelled faintly, in certain rooms when the air moved a particular way, like wood and linseed oil in someone else's life. And that smell kept arriving when she wasn't braced for it. Early mornings in the kitchen, evenings in the hallway near the storage room, and each time it arrived, she stood with it for a moment before she moved on. She was handling it. 3 weeks passed. The investigation widened. David's team turned up 2 additional financial advisors who had been coordinating with Catherine's proxy moves, which strengthened the documentation considerably and added a dimension to the case that crossed from board misconduct into securities law. He brought in an external firm that specialized in exactly this kind of corporate fraud, and their preliminary assessment was direct. The evidence was sufficient. What remained was process. Ethan found out about the scope of the fraud not from Isabella, but from a news alert on his phone, which was how she discovered that she had fallen into her oldest habit, handling things alone, not because she didn't trust him, but because the habit lived deeper than trust, embedded in something older than this arrangement, and she hadn't caught it in time. He texted her. Just 3 words. "Are you okay?" Not a question mark. Just the words, flat, and the absence of the punctuation said more than the words did. It said he was trying to be careful about how much he asked, trying to stay on the correct side of a line they'd drawn by his leaving. She stared at the text for longer than she should have. Then she typed back, "Yes, the case is stronger than we thought." He replied, "Good." She looked at that word on her screen, 4 letters, period, complete, and felt the flatness of it like a physical thing. Not because it was cold, because it was careful. Because he was being exactly as careful as she had always been, and she now knew what that careful distance cost because she'd seen the inside of it from the other side. She put her phone down and went back to work. Sophie called on a Saturday morning. It was unexpected enough that Isabella, seeing the name on the screen, Ethan had apparently given Sophie her own contact entry at some point, written as Sophie B with a small fox emoji, sat down on the kitchen stool before answering. "Hello?" she said. "Hi." Sophie's voice was the same, slightly out of breath, the way she always was when she'd been running around before remembering she needed to make a call. "Daddy doesn't know I'm calling. I wanted to ask you something." "Okay," Isabella said. "Are you coming to Delhi's on Saturday?" "You said sometimes." Isabella looked at the kitchen table where no one was currently sitting across from her with eggs and toast. I didn't know if that was still. We go every Saturday, Sophie said. Daddy gets the boring thing. I get blueberries. There's room for you. A pause. Does your dad know you're asking? I said he doesn't know I'm calling. Sophie's tone had the mild exasperation of someone dealing with a slow student. I'm asking because I want to ask. Raymond misses you. I think Daddy is sad, but he does the face where he's not sad, so I can't tell for sure. And I miss you, so you should come. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February morning was cold and clear, and the river was doing what it always did regardless of everything. What face does he make? She asked. When he's not sad. The one where his jaw is really still, Sophie said, like he's trying to look normal. Isabella thought about a man in her kitchen once saying you're doing the thing with your jaw, where you're holding it very still because you're trying to look calm. She thought about the fact that she and Ethan had apparently spent the past 3 weeks making the same face at each other from separate locations. Okay, she said. I'll come Saturday. Okay, Sophie said, satisfied. Bring the ambassador. Raymond wants to see him. She meant the stuffed fox, which was still on the shelf in what had been Sophie's room. Isabella had not moved it. I'll bring him, she said. She heard Sophie put the phone down without quite hanging up and call, at full volume, Daddy, Isabella's coming Saturday. And she heard, faintly, Ethan's voice from some other room saying something she couldn't make out, and then the call ended. She sat in her kitchen for a while after that, with the fox on the shelf down the hall, and the drawings on the refrigerator and the faint smell that came and went, and she thought about what it meant to choose protection over truth so many times that the protection became the thing you were protecting instead of the thing underneath it. She had spent 30 years building walls and calling them competence. She had been so careful, so consistently careful, and careful had kept her standing and kept her company and kept everything she'd inherited and rebuilt, and careful had also, without her particularly noticing, kept out everything else. Ethan had not been careful. That was the thing she'd been circling without landing on. He had shown up in his own life, the grief, the daughter, the workshop, the dinners, the blanket fort, the note on the counter, with a consistency that wasn't about safety. He put things down in front of people and let them matter, and accepted that mattering was a risk. He had done that with Kara. He had done it carefully but genuinely with Sophie. And somewhere in 4 months of kitchens and Sunday papers and low-lit conversations, he had started doing it with her. And she had stood in a kitchen and chosen the careful thing. She picked up her phone and called David. The board meeting next week, she said. I want full transparency. Everything we have on Catherine and Whitmore goes to every board member simultaneously. No pre-briefings, no managed rollouts. Everyone gets the full picture at once. David was quiet for a moment. That's a riskier approach than, I know. Do it anyway. Another pause. Can I ask why the change? Because managed rollouts are about controlling the narrative, she said. And I'm done managing narratives. There was a silence on his end that she recognized as him recalibrating. Okay, he said. Full transparency. Full transparency? She confirmed. She hung up. She stood at the window and looked at the river, and she thought about a fox who always found his way home. About an 8-year-old who said you were already on it, I just hadn't labeled you yet. About a man who had said, I believe you in a woodworking shop in the rain, before he had any reason to. She thought about what she was going to say on Saturday morning at Deli's. She had not planned speeches in her personal life before. She planned them constantly in her professional one, knew every word before she walked into every room. But this was different. She was going to walk into a diner and sit across from someone she had almost said something to and hadn't, and she was going to say it. And she did not know how it would land, and she was going to say it anyway. The week moved as weeks do when you are waiting for something, slowly in the days and suddenly in the hours. The board meeting happened on Wednesday. Isabella presented the full documentation, all of it, simultaneously to every board member in the room. No narrative management, no prepositioned allies. Just the evidence and the truth of it laid flat on the table. The room was quiet for a long time when she finished. Then Margaret Holloway said, Catherine Sterling should have her proxy rights formally revoked pending the conclusion of the legal process. It passed unanimously. Gerald Whitmore abstained, which was the only vote he had left to cast. He resigned from the board the following morning by email, without a statement, which was the quiet final sound of a structure collapsing. She drove home on Wednesday evening, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, she sat in her car in the parking garage and did not immediately reach for her phone. She sat in the quiet for several minutes. She thought about her grandfather, who had worried about her being alone. She thought about the clause he'd put in the will and what Catherine had said about it, that maybe the clause was never about the company, that maybe it was a push. She thought he might have been, in his difficult, indirect, expensive way, right? She went upstairs. She took the fox off the shelf in Sophie's room and set him on the kitchen counter where she'd see him in the morning. She slept better than she had in weeks. Saturday came. Deli's was the same. Sticky menus, Greta with her coffee pot, the window table where Sophie had cataloged the entire Savannah Street scene the first time they'd come. Sophie was already in the booth when Isabella arrived, 7 minutes late because she'd gone back for the fox and then found a parking spot that required 3 attempts, and Sophie saw her through the window and waved with both hands. Ethan was sitting across from her. He looked up when Isabella came through the door. He looked the same. He was wearing a flannel shirt she recognized, the green one from the workshop, and he had sawdust on his forearms because he'd probably been in the shop that morning, and his expression when he saw her was doing several things at once, in the way that faces do when they've been held still for a long time and something loosens them. "You came," Sophie said. "I said I would." "You brought the ambassador." Sophie reached across the table for the fox, which Isabella had carried in somewhat self-consciously and which now felt extremely correct to have brought. Sophie set Raymond and the ambassador side by side at the edge of the table with the gravity of a diplomat arranging a summit. Now they can catch up. Isabella sat down. She sat across from Ethan, which was where she'd always sat in this booth. And Greta appeared immediately with the coffee pot, and Ethan's hand was flat on the table between them, not reaching, just resting. They ordered. Sophie got blueberry pancakes. Ethan ordered the eggs and toast. Isabella looked at her menu and then at Ethan and said, "I'll have what he's having." Sophie looked up. "You're getting the boring thing?" "I want to try it," Isabella said. Ethan looked at her over his menu, something careful and quiet in his eyes. "Okay," Sophie said, though she was clearly reserving judgment. The eggs and toast were, objectively, unremarkable. Greta brought them with the same cheerful efficiency as always, and Isabella ate them, and they were fine, sustaining, honest, unpretentious, and she thought that Ethan ordering the same thing every Saturday had never been about the food being the best option. It was about knowing what you wanted and not being performed out of it. Sophie spent 15 minutes explaining a complicated social situation involving Phoebe, a girl named Margot, and a misunderstanding about whose turn it was to be line leader, which required her full attention and therefore freed the adults at the table from having to fill the silence themselves, for which Isabella was privately grateful. Then Sophie said she needed to go to the bathroom and climbed out of the booth with her characteristic lack of ceremony, and Isabella and Ethan were alone with the coffee and the remnants of breakfast and the 2 stuffed animals presiding over the edge of the table. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "How are you?" he said. "Better?" she said. "The board voted Wednesday. Catherine's proxies are revoked. Whitmore resigned." "I saw." "Then you know it's done." "Yes." He turned his coffee mug. The slow circle, the familiar gesture. "That's not what I was asking." She looked at him. He looked back, and in his face was the same thing she'd been carrying around for 3 weeks. The same careful, costly distance. The same thing held just below the surface. "I was going to say something," she said, "in the kitchen. 3 days after the leak, when we were talking about the board. I said, it doesn't have to. And then I stopped." He was very still. "I stopped because I was scared," she said, "which is not something I say easily. I've been scared in boardrooms and scared in courtrooms and scared in my grandfather's office. And I have never once said it out loud because saying it out loud costs something, and I have never been willing to pay that particular cost." She paused. "I'm paying it now." "Isabella, let me finish." Not a command. A request, almost. "I spent 4 months in an apartment with you and Sophie, and something happened to me that I did not plan for and could not manage and did not want to stop. And I know the arrangement was what it was. I know you had reasons for leaving that I understood and still understand, but I stood in a kitchen and chose the careful thing. And I have been choosing the careful thing for 30 years, and I am really tired of how alone that is. The sentence came out slightly rougher than she'd intended, less polished. She left it there because polishing it would have been the careful thing. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the expression she had never been able to read completely, the one that was something more than careful attention, but something less than what she was hoping for. And she sat with the not knowing, which was the hardest part. "You know what I told Sophie the first morning after we moved out?" he said. She shook her head. She asked if Isabella was still our person. He said it simply. She said it like that. Our person. And I said, I told her people's situations were complicated and that just because two people cared about each other didn't always mean they were in the same place at the same time. He paused. She said that was a very long way of saying I didn't know. She's perceptive, Isabella said. She really is. He looked at the table, then back at her. I left because I thought it was the right thing. I left because I was trying to be responsible about Sophie, about what I was feeling, about what was real and what was proximity and shared kitchen time. He stopped. And I've spent 3 weeks in my house, in the actual quiet, without any of those things to blame it on. And the thing is still there. Isabella waited. The thing, he said, is that I love you. He said it without preamble or ceremony, in the same voice he used to tell her the toast was ready or the car needed an oil change. Direct, without performance, the way he said things that were simply true. I've probably been in the process of loving you since December, and I've been calling it other things because other things were safer to call it. But I've been in the quiet for 3 weeks, and I know the difference now. She had been ready to say something. She had a response prepared, in the way that she always prepared responses. It was gone completely. I'm not asking you to, he started. I love you, she said. I should have said it in November. I definitely should have said it in December. I absolutely should have said it the night the board situation resolved and we were standing in the kitchen and I could feel you not saying it, and I could feel myself not saying it, and we both went to bed and didn't say it. She shook her head. I'm saying it now. I love you. I have been figuring out how to be a person who lets things matter, and you have been the reason I know the difference. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in the way that moments look in movies, with light and swelling orchestras. Just the particular shifting of a face that has been holding something tightly for a long time and can finally, carefully, put it down. We're going to have to figure out a lot of things, he said. I know. Sophie is involved now, which means I know, Ethan. This isn't me saying no. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her. I'm just saying it's going to be complicated. Everything in my life is complicated, she said. I know. And then, quietly, careful, genuinely, but not everything needs to be. She recognized the words. She'd said them to him once, or something close to them. He'd filed them, the way he filed everything, and he was handing them back now, which was so precisely him that she felt it somewhere in her sternum. Sophie came back from the bathroom, slid back into the booth, looked at both of them with the frank, comprehensive assessment of someone who had been watching adults her entire life and had developed considerable expertise. Are you figured out? She asked. Getting there, Ethan said. Okay. She picked up her fork. I'm going to need more pancakes. Greta was summoned. More pancakes were ordered. The table settled back into its Saturday rhythm. Sophie talking, Ethan listening, Isabella sitting in a booth at delis eating eggs and toast that were unremarkable and somehow exactly right, with the two stuffed animals still conducting their summit at the edge of the table. After they walked, not with any particular destination, Sophie decided the direction and they followed, because Sophie's navigation in Savannah was directionally inconsistent but experientially reliable, meaning you ended up at places you wouldn't have chosen but were consistently worth being at. She led them through the historic district in the February cold, the oaks overhead bare and beautiful, the cobblestones wet from an earlier frost. She walked between them, and about 10 minutes in she took both of their hands without asking, without announcing it, the way she'd taken Isabella's hand outside the clerk's office 5 months ago. Ethan caught Isabella's eye over the top of Sophie's head. She caught his. There was no word for the look they exchanged that wasn't too large for a public sidewalk in February with an 8-year-old chattering between them. So they didn't use words. They just walked, the three of them, in the complicated, ordinary grace of people finding their way towards something they hadn't planned for and couldn't have imagined and were choosing anyway. The legal resolution of the Catherine Sterling case took another 4 months, which was faster than David had predicted and slower than Isabella had hoped, which was precisely the nature of legal resolutions. Catherine retained excellent counsel and contested every element of the documentation, and the process was grinding and expensive and occasionally infuriating, and it ended the way well-documented cases end when the evidence is what it is. With a settlement that included Catherine's removal from all Sterling estate interests, a formal board censure, and an agreement that kept the whole thing out of criminal court in exchange for full cooperation. Gerald Whitmore's resignation had already removed him from Isabella's immediate professional sphere. He resurfaced 6 months later at a smaller firm in Atlanta, which was his business, and Isabella did not spend time on it. Margaret Holloway called Isabella after the settlement was finalized and said simply, "Your grandfather would be satisfied," which was not the same as proud, but it was what Harrison Sterling would have said, and Isabella understood the distinction and accepted it as the genuine thing it was. The second wedding was not technically a wedding at all. There was no ceremony, no plan, no date set on a calendar with a PR team and a legal team and a photographer. What there was instead was a Tuesday evening in June on the rooftop of Ethan's workshop, which he'd discovered had a flat section accessible through a hatch in the ceiling and a view of the Savannah skyline going orange and rose in the early evening. He had told her to come by the shop at 6. He hadn't said why. She'd come, in a summer dress because it was June, and the formality of her work clothes felt wrong for a Tuesday evening at a woodworking shop, and Travis had let her in and pointed at the ceiling with a grin that suggested he had context she didn't, and she'd climbed the hatch. Ethan was up there. He'd brought 2 folding chairs and a bottle of wine and the kind of nothing else that communicates more than elaborate preparation. The city was spread out below them, the river catching the sunset, the oaks in the squares visible from this height as dark round masses of green. He handed her a glass. They stood at the edge of the roof and watched the light change. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Okay," she said. "Last time we did this, the whole legal contract formal arrangement version, it was because you needed something and I was the closest available option." He paused, and in the pause was something she recognized as him being careful not with his feelings, but with his words, choosing the ones that were exactly accurate. "I've been thinking about the difference between what that was and what I actually want to ask." She looked at him. The light was doing something specific to his face, the orange of it warm against his dark eyes, and he looked like himself, completely, imperfectly, fully himself. "The first time I married you," he said, "it was because 14,000 people needed their jobs, and you needed a solution, and I couldn't think of a reason good enough to say no." He looked at her directly. "This time I want to marry you because I've spent 8 months watching you figure out how to let things matter, and I want to be the person next to you while you keep doing that. And I want Sophie to grow up in a house where she can see what it looks like when 2 people choose each other, not because it's convenient, but because it's true." He reached into his jacket pocket. He brought out the plain gold band from the county clerk's office, the one from the first ceremony, the one she'd taken off and left on the kitchen counter when he'd moved out, and which she had not been able to throw away or put in a drawer. She'd put it in a coffee tin in the kitchen, which was where he'd apparently found it. "It's the same ring," he said. "I couldn't see the point in a different one." "It's a good ring," she said, which was not the most romantic sentence ever spoken, but was true, and truth between them had always mattered more than performance. "Yeah," he said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were warm the way they'd been in the clerk's office the first time, and there was still a scar on the back of his right hand that she had touched once in the dark, carefully, without waking him. She pressed her thumb against it now, deliberately, in the last of the evening light. He kissed her, not dramatically, with the completeness of something that had been waiting a long time to be exactly what it was. Below them, from somewhere in the shop, Sophie's voice. "Is it done? Travis said I have to wait, but I want to know." Ethan put his forehead against Isabella's and almost laughed. "She's been down there for 20 minutes. You told her. She was going to figure it out anyway. She always does." "Daddy." He raised his voice. "Yes, Sophie." "Is she staying?" He looked at Isabella. She looked at him. "Yeah, Bug," he called. "She's staying." A pause. Then, "Okay. Travis says there's ice cream." "There's ice cream," Ethan confirmed to Isabella, as if this required clarification. "Of course there is," she said. The hatch opened and Sophie came through it at speed, in her fox print pajamas because it was a Tuesday evening and she was 8 and she had apparently changed into pajamas in anticipation of a celebration. And she looked at the ring on Isabella's hand and at her father's face and at Isabella's face, and then she threw herself at both of them with the full, uncalculated force of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular outcome and was not going to undercommit to it now. The three of them stood on a rooftop in Savannah in the last of the June evening, tangled together and slightly off balance, and nothing like the clean, composed image of a family in a photograph. Sophie smelled like strawberry shampoo. Ethan's chin was on the top of Isabella's head. The city went about its business below, indifferent and lovely, and somewhere down there the river moved in its patient way, carrying everything forward. "The ambassador needs to be on the roof," Sophie said, into the general middle of the huddle. "We'll bring him up," Ethan said. "He's been inside too long." "Okay, Bug." "And I need a new drawing," Sophie said. "The one on the refrigerator doesn't have a roof." "We can add a roof," Isabella said. "I'll draw it tonight." Sophie pulled back and looked at both of them with the comprehensive survey of someone confirming her accounting. "We're all on the map now." "We're all on the map," Isabella confirmed. Sophie nodded, satisfied, the way she'd been satisfied about the ambassador's title and Raymond's name and the outcome of board discussion she half understood and the fundamental arrangement of the world as she believed it ought to be. "Okay," she said. "Ice cream." She went back down through the hatch. Ethan looked at Isabella. Isabella looked at Ethan. There was a version of this moment, in a different story about different people, that would have been perfect. Clean resolution, swelling emotion, everything falling into place with the satisfying click of a well-written ending. This was not that. Isabella still had board meetings on Monday mornings, and a legal process winding down, and a company that required daily decisions, and a relationship with her father that would probably never be repaired, and a mother who sent Christmas cards from a careful distance. Ethan still had a workshop with a truck that embarrassed Sophie, and a business loan, and a drawer full of Kara's things he hadn't sorted through yet because grief is not linear and does not schedule itself around new beginnings. They were not fixed, either of them. They were not transformed into better versions of themselves. They were the same people they had been in a county clerk's office in October, complicated, imperfect, carrying the specific weights of their specific histories. The difference was that they were choosing to carry them in the same direction. That was the thing that nobody told you about the big moments. They didn't happen in the absence of your problems. They happened right in the middle of them. On a Tuesday evening on a rooftop with the last of the June light going out, and ice cream waiting downstairs, and a child who had decided months ago that you were already on the map and had simply been waiting for you to figure it out yourself. Isabella Sterling, who had spent her life measuring success in quarterly projections and board votes, and the precise management of outcomes she could control, stood in the warm dark of a Savannah rooftop and felt something she did not immediately try to categorize or manage or fit into an existing framework. It wasn't happiness exactly, or not only that. It was something more specific. The feeling of being in a place she had not planned to arrive at, having taken a road she would never have chosen, standing next to someone who had said, "I believe you," before he had any reason to, and had kept believing her even when she'd made it difficult, which was most of the time. She had not known, at 30 years old, that this was the thing she had been building toward without knowing it. That the empire and the claws and the rainstorm and the woodworking shop had all been, in their separate ways, routes to a rooftop in June with a man she loved and a child who had already put her on the map. Her grandfather had been worried about her being alone. He had, in his difficult, circuitous, legally complicated way, done something about it. She thought she might stop being angry about the claws. She looked at the ring on her finger, plain gold, slightly scratched now from the months in a coffee tin, unimpressive by every metric she'd once used to measure such things. She thought it was the best thing she owned. Below, Sophie called again from the bottom of the hatch. "The ice cream is melting." "Coming," they said, both of them, at the same time, and then looked at each other, and this time the thing that was in the same neighborhood as a smile arrived completely, for both of them, unguarded, real. They went downstairs. The ice cream was vanilla and slightly melted, and Sophie had already started without them, which was exactly right. Travis had brought extra spoons. The workshop smelled like pine and linseed oil in the June evening, the familiar smell of a place that had become, over the course of an improbable year, the beginning of something Isabella had not known she was capable of building. Not an empire. Nothing with her name on a building. Something smaller, sturdier, and considerably harder to walk away from. They sat in the workshop in the evening light, the three of them, eating ice cream from the container with extra spoons, and Sophie told them about a plan she had to teach Raymond the fox to sit up using a system of small props she'd been developing, which Ethan said was structurally unsound, and Isabella said showed considerable engineering initiative. And Sophie said Isabella was her favorite for saying that, which Ethan said was unfair. "You're both my favorites," Sophie said, in the diplomatic manner of someone managing two adults gracefully. But Isabella said the better thing this time. "Story of my life," Ethan said. "Your eggs and toast," Isabella said, "were very good." Was that a compliment? A strongly worded one. Sophie looked between them and seemed satisfied that the adults in her life were operating correctly, which they were, more or less, in the imprecise and ongoing way that people who have chosen each other actually operate. Not perfectly, not without friction, not without the history they carried and the complications that didn't resolve just because the love was real. But choosing. Every day, in the small, ordinary decisions that don't look like decisions until you add them up. That was what it looked like, in the end. Not a dramatic moment of transformation. Just two people and a child in a woodworking shop in June, with melting ice cream and a stuffed fox and the sound of Savannah going quiet outside, adding one more ordinary evening to the accumulating record of a life they were building together, day by day, Tuesday by Tuesday. Real.